Hey guys, tonight we step into the shadow of a medieval city where the cathedral bells toll like iron hearts beating across the cobblestones. It is the year 1215, and you stand in the square of Chartres, France, where pilgrims shuffle forward in ragged lines, candles flickering in their hands, the smell of wax and sweat thick in the air. The bishop's palace rises above the crowd, its stone walls glinting gold in torchlight, banners of the cross draped proudly over windows. You probably won't survive this century if you're born poor, but tonight you're granted the strange privilege of seeing how one man in a mitre hat commands thousands like a monarch. The bishop isn't just a priest, he's judge, landlord and kingmaker. His eyes sweep over the crowd like a hawk surveying prey. If you're new here, remember to subscribe for more calm history, strange, scandalous and soothing tales like this one. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to know where and when you're listening to this story of power and purity gone wrong. And hey, stay with me until the end, because tonight we're unraveling why bishops claimed virgins in the name of God. Sleep may take you before the tale finishes, but the church's grip on history never loosens. Sweet dreams, if the bells let you. The first thing you notice, standing in that French square, is how bishops wield power that seems both divine and terrifyingly earthly. Unlike the humble village priest with mud on his boots, a bishop strides through incense clouds, robed in silk, jeweled rings flashing like swords of light. He commands armies of clerks and monks, but also knights sworn to defend church property. You realize quickly that when a bishop passes, even the city guards bow lower than they would to a duke. He is both shepherd and wolf, depending on which side of his crozier you fall. The medieval world is a hierarchy, and bishops sit right beneath kings and the pope, perched like hawks on perches of stone. They collect taxes. Yes, taxes, not just donations. And they oversee courts where peasants are tried for sins that double as crimes. Imagine stealing bread because your child is hungry, only to be hauled before a bishop's tribunal and fined into deeper misery. Yet the same bishop dines in a hall where roasted swan, spiced wine and candied figs weigh the table. You're told he represents Christ, but the lifestyle looks far more imperial than Galilean. What makes bishops particularly untouchable is the illusion that their authority flows straight from heaven. In ceremonies, they're anointed with holy oil, a symbolic pouring of divine power onto their flesh. Crowds kneel as if God himself has stepped into the room. But behind that mystical aura, you can see the mechanics of raw power. Bishops control land, inherit wealth, and hold sway over kings desperate for church approval. Their signatures on parchment decide whether wars are blessed or condemned. To oppose a bishop is to risk eternal damnation, or at least excommunication, which in medieval terms feels like the same thing. Walk with me through the cathedral interior, and you'll see the living symbol of their reach. Stained glass windows tower above, each pane glowing with scenes of saints who chose purity over pleasure, sacrifice over survival. The stories are carefully chosen: virgin martyrs who refused marriage, women who sealed their virtue for God alone. These images are not passive art, they're propaganda, whispering to every girl who enters the nave that her body is a battlefield where salvation or damnation will be decided. And who, of course, presides over these symbols? The bishop seated high in his throne, the master of which stories get told. The bishop's palace itself is a fortress of contradiction. Stone walls echo with chants, but also with scraping of servants carrying barrels of wine, the rustle of scribes tallying rents, the low laughter of noble guests enjoying hospitality. You'd expect a house of prayer, but it looks more like a castle, and that's the point. Bishops are not mere guides of souls, they are landlords whose power stretches across villages, fields and convent walls. A farmer owes his tithe of grain, a widow her coins, a maiden her obedience, all funneling upward until the bishop decides who gets grace and who gets ruin. Step into the bishop's council chamber, and you'll find him not alone, but surrounded by lawyers, knights and priests, who know the exact value of each soul that passes through. Charters are signed granting privileges, but also stripping freedoms. A monastery in the countryside is ordered to provide annual tribute. What tribute? Sometimes money, sometimes livestock, sometimes daughters offered as consecrated virgins. The logic flows so smoothly you almost miss the coercion. What family wouldn't surrender a daughter if it meant favor with God and the powerful man who speaks in his name? By the early 13th century, bishops had transformed themselves into brokers of divine purity. The cult of virginity, exalting untouched women as holier than wives or mothers, gave bishops enormous leverage. You look around and realize, in this system, every virgin is a kind of currency. Families pay with daughters, hoping their gift buys eternal salvation, a lighter tax or forgiveness for sins too heavy to bear. And standing in the middle of this exchange, tallying the spiritual accounts like a banker, is the bishop. But how does he justify this? Listen to the sermons echoing from the pulpit. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. But purity in the medieval mind is inseparable from sexual abstinence. Bishops preach that a virgin's untouched body mirrors the Virgin Mary, the holiest of all. This idea plants itself in the imagination like a root that cannot be pulled out. Girls are not just human beings, they're vessels of sacred power, waiting to be consecrated, directed, and yes, controlled. And who decides the terms of consecration? The bishop. Outside the cathedral, in the marketplace, peasants whisper stories that show the other side of this holiness. The bishop took the girl into his service, someone mutters. Another adds, her family says it's God's will. The crowd nods, but no one raises a protest. Fear is stronger than outrage here. The bishop's word is law, and the community's silence becomes complicity. Virgins disappear behind convent gates, some sincerely devoted, others terrified. Either way, the bishop's authority stretches not just into homes, but into bedrooms and wombs. Now, step closer to the bishop himself. You smell incense clinging to his robe, but beneath it, the sweat of power, heavy, unavoidable, human. His ring glitters as he lifts his hand in blessing. A gesture rehearsed to inspire awe. People kneel, muttering prayers, while he surveys them with the calm of someone who knows no one dares defy him. This is the essence of medieval episcopal power, the mixture of spiritual awe and earthly dominance, of holiness and fear. And here's where you glimpse the machinery behind the myths. Bishops rise to this position not by chance, but by patronage, politics, and ruthless ambition. Many are younger sons of noble families, given church careers to keep estates intact. They are trained not only in theology but in law, warfare, and statecraft. They climb ranks through cunning deals, bribes, and alliances. By the time a man becomes bishop, he is less a shepherd of souls and more a seasoned politician in a robe. The virgins he takes under his protection are pawns in a wider chessboard of influence. What makes it worse is how effectively the church cloaks this ambition in ritual. You attend a mass led by the bishop, candles blaze, choirs chant, and the Eucharist glitters like a miracle. The performance convinces you that heaven itself has touched earth. In that moment, you're less likely to question the man's private actions. How could someone so radiant, so sanctified in ceremony, possibly be abusing his authority? And yet history tells us many. Imagine being a young girl in this world. Your fate is not yours to choose. If the bishop points to you, your parents may hand you over with pride or with dread, but they will hand you over. The choice isn't really theirs either. Everyone lives under the long shadow of the church. To refuse risks damnation, or worse, the bishop's anger, which can translate into excommunication, confiscation, or ruin. One man in silk can make or break an entire lineage. This is why, when we ask why bishops took virgins in the name of God, we cannot simply say because they could. The better answer is because the entire system, from theology to art, from law to fear, made it possible, acceptable, even holy. You watch the bishop descend from his throne, crozier tapping stone, and the crowd parts like water before him. Somewhere a girl is chosen, somewhere a family sighs relief or despair, and the machine rolls on. You can't help but notice the irony. Christ preached humility, poverty, and care for the weak. Yet here, his representatives hoard wealth, wield soldiers, and claim virgins as tokens of divine favor. If you weren't so busy surviving in this century, you might laugh at the contradiction, but survival leaves little room for irony. You bow with the rest, because what else can you do? Night falls on the city of Chartres, torches sputter, the crowd disperses, and the bishop's palace shutters close. Inside, decisions are made that will shape the lives of peasants, nobles and virgins alike. Outside, the streets smell of manure and smoke, the reality of life for everyone else. You realize that to live under a bishop's power is to live inside a paradox. God's grace promised at the price of human submission, and for many, especially women, that price was virginity itself. So the bells toll again, echoing across the rooftops, carrying the bishop's authority into every ear. You stand there in the cold air, wondering whether anyone will ever dare to challenge him. For now, no one does. The bishop's world remains intact, his power unquestioned, his right to claim virgins defended by scripture, law and fear. And you, caught in this moment, see the first layer of the answer. Bishops took virgins in the name of God, because the world let you walk deeper into the cathedral's shadows and realize that behind every jeweled window and chanted hymn lies an obsession so thick it shapes an entire culture: virginity. The medieval church doesn't just admire purity, it weaponizes it. Virginity becomes the gold standard of holiness, a spiritual currency that even kings cannot buy. And the bishops, positioned as guardians of this ideal, hold the keys to defining what counts as pure and who counts as holy. It isn't a preference, it's an obsession carved into sermons, canon law, and even architecture. Think of how stories are told in this world. Every homily, every saint's tale, leans into the same motif. The virgin who resists temptation and remains untouched becomes a heroine of heaven. Agnes, Cecilia, Lucy, names that echo in stained glass. All martyrs who refused marriage or worldly pleasures. Their stories are exaggerated until they glow like halos, girls who would rather die than give their bodies away. And this isn't presented as tragic, it's heroic. You sit in a pew listening and realize the whole community is being trained to see virginity not as a personal choice, but as the highest possible offering to God. Why does this matter to bishops? Because once virginity becomes divine capital, someone has to manage the treasury. That role falls neatly into their hands. Bishops claim they are protectors of virgins, defenders of their chastity, guardians of the holy vow, but in practice they become managers of a fragile and profitable resource. Virgins are treated like rare relics, their purity carefully overseen, controlled and distributed according to ecclesiastical interests. And if a bishop whispers that he alone can determine whether a girl's virginity is properly consecrated, who dares challenge him? The sermons aren't just spiritual, they're practical instructions for families. Parents are told that offering a daughter's virginity to God through the church is the most blessed act they can perform. It ensures salvation for her, honor for the family, and eternal glory in heaven. The bishop's rhetoric pushes mothers and fathers into impossible corners. Marry your daughter to a man, or surrender her to God, meaning to the bishop's jurisdiction. Either way, her body is not really hers. In one scenario, it belongs to a husband. In the other, it belongs to the church. Autonomy is an idea that never even surfaces. Walk outside the cathedral, watch the girls file in on feast days, their hair braided with ribbons, their dresses freshly washed. They look like they're attending a festival, yet beneath the cheerful music of bells lies an undercurrent of fear. They've been told since childhood that the slightest touch, the smallest blemish, can shatter their spiritual worth. A stolen kiss, a careless rumor, a brush of desire, they risk becoming spoiled goods. Virginity is presented as fragile glass, always one crack away from ruin, and bishops ensure that everyone believes only they can judge whether the glass remains whole. You notice that the theology surrounding virginity is laced with contradictions. On one hand, bishops praise virgins as untouchable treasures, holier than wives or widows. On the other, they insist these treasures require constant supervision by men in authority, of course. The result is a twisted balance. Women are elevated but also imprisoned, revered but also infantilized. Virginity is sacred, but only as long as it's kept under male oversight. You can almost hear the collective sigh of girls who realize they're not being praised so much as they're being trapped. The bishop doesn't just preach virginity from the pulpit, he embodies it as institutional doctrine. When he walks through the marketplace, mothers tug daughters closer, fathers nod with wary respect. His gaze seems to measure each girl, not with desire exactly, but with assessment, like a merchant evaluating fine cloth. The obsession with virginity creates an entire market of fear and reverence, and the bishop is its broker. In a society where almost every other path is blocked, purity becomes the only ladder for women to climb, and bishops hold the rungs. Behind convent walls, the obsession intensifies. Nuns are celebrated not just for their devotion but specifically for their sexual renunciation. Bishops visit convents to remind the sisters of their holy state, reinforcing again and again that their worth lies in what they refuse to do, and yet these visits often blur boundaries. The same man who praises purity also inspects living quarters, questions private habits, and listens to confessions whispered in secrecy. Virginity becomes both shield and vulnerability, exalting women while also exposing them to intrusive scrutiny by bishops claiming divine authority. You might wonder, why did medieval culture choose virginity as its ultimate measure of holiness? The answer lies in the Church's fixation on control. Virginity is visible, or at least it is imagined to be visible. Unlike charity or humility, it's treated as a tangible condition, something that can be monitored, guarded, even tested. The bishop doesn't need to measure a girl's soul. He needs only to control her body. By elevating virginity, the Church creates a clear standard that conveniently puts bishops in charge of defining, protecting, and exploiting it. Consider how much pressure this creates in daily life. A girl walking home from the market feels eyes on her constantly. Neighbors, parents, confessors. Gossip alone can damage her reputation, and bishops exploit this by presenting themselves as arbiters of truth. If a rumor arises, a family might bring her to bishop for reassurance or penance. Imagine being 16, dragged before a man in robes, asked invasive questions about your virtue, and then sent away branded holy or suspicious. That's not protection, it's surveillance wrapped in scripture. Virginity becomes so intertwined with status that it affects inheritance, dowries, and alliances. A family can gain honor by dedicating a virgin daughter to God, which means dedicating her to the bishop's oversight. Another family might marry their daughter to secure land. In both cases, the girl's worth is transacted through her body. Bishops exploit this obsession by positioning themselves as the ultimate judges. They know the theology, they hold the rituals, and they alone can pronounce a virgin sacred or fallen. It's less about faith than about monopoly. Even the language surrounding virginity reinforces its mystique. Bishops use words like Bride of Christ and Temple of the Spirit, elevating virgins into almost mythical beings. But beneath the poetry lurks a darker reality. These titles bind women to lifelong obligations, stripping away choice. Once a bishop declares a girl consecrated, turning back is nearly impossible without disgrace. The words sound holy, but they function as chains. You see the brilliance of the system. It makes imprisonment look like exaltation. And here's the strangest twist. You realize the obsession with virginity often coexists with a culture of clerical hypocrisy. Everyone knows bishops themselves are not always paragons of celibacy. Whispered rumors of mistresses, illegitimate children, and quiet indulgences circulate through towns, but these do not diminish the bishop's authority over virgins. On the contrary, the contrast makes the obsession more useful. The bishop's personal failings vanish in the glow of his role as guardian of others' purity. He preaches what he does not practice, and no one dares point out the contradiction. As you reflect, you see how this obsession isn't just about individual girls, it's about power structures. By controlling virginity, bishops maintain leverage over families, convents, and entire communities. A father seeking favor with the church offers his daughter, a mother worried about salvation, prays the bishop will accept her child as pure. A community afraid of sin looks to the bishop to declare who is holy. Every path of fear leads back to him, reinforced by sermons and stained glass that depict virgins as the heroes of salvation. In this world, virginity is not simply abstinence. It is identity, destiny, and currency. To lose it outside the bishop's sanctioned channels is to lose everything. To offer it under his supervision is to gain a strange kind of immortality. But always, the bishop is the broker of this exchange. He reaps the spiritual prestige, the financial donations, and the political loyalty that come with each consecrated virgin. The obsession with virginity is less about women's holiness than about bishops' power. The irony is sharp. The Church preaches that virginity mirrors the purity of Mary, who submitted willingly to God's will. But in practice, submission isn't to God, it's to the bishop who claims to represent him. Girls aren't offered heavenly freedom. They're absorbed into earthly structures of control. And families play along, convinced they're buying favor in heaven when they're really securing influence on earth. You stand in the cathedral and feel the weight of centuries pressing down. The obsession with virginity has never been about women. It has always been about men. The bells ring again, calling the faithful to Vespers. As the voices rise in chant, you hear beneath the music the steady rhythm of control. Virginity elevated, women contained, bishops enthroned. The obsession pulses through every brick of the cathedral, every echo of scripture. And you, standing in the half-light, see how the entire system thrives, not despite its contradictions, but because of them. Virginity is both shield and snare, blessing and burden, salvation and exploitation, and bishops cloaked in holiness stand at its center. So the candles gutter, the chants fade, and the crowd disperses, but the idea of virginity remains, stronger than stone, more lasting than incense. It will continue to shape lives long after tonight, binding women to vows they didn't freely choose, elevating bishops into guardians they didn't deserve. The obsession isn't just medieval, it's systemic, a pillar holding up the Church's authority. And you, walking out into the cold night air, finally see why bishops' power over virgins was never accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and sanctified in the name of God. You soon realize that the obsession with virginity doesn't just float in the realm of sermons and stained glass. It is codified, written into law, and enforced with terrifying seriousness. Canon law, the Church's legal system, becomes the invisible net cast over every woman's body. It dictates when she may marry, if she may refuse, how she must confess, and even what penance she must endure if accused of losing her purity. And standing at the top of that legal pyramid is the bishop, interpreting, enforcing, and bending these rules as he pleases. Marriage, for example, is no longer a simple agreement between two families. Canon law requires a priest's blessing, and bishops oversee the priests. That means the Church has turned a personal contract into a sacrament under its control. A girl may be betrothed by her parents at 12, but the bishop's representatives ensure that her union is sanctioned before God. Without the Church's recognition, the marriage is not valid, no matter how many cows or coins changed hands. You see what that means? Women's most basic life decision, whom to marry and when, has been absorbed into the bishop's jurisdiction. Canon law also insists that women may not be forced into marriage against their will. At least in theory, bishops proudly cite this as proof of their protection of the weak. But in practice, you watch how the loopholes swallow the law. A girl may declare her refusal, but her parents and the bishop together can guide her toward the proper choice. Consent becomes less a matter of freedom than a ritual phrase spoken under pressure. Once the bishop nods approval, the words "I do" carry the weight of eternity, and there is no undoing them. Chastity, too, becomes legal property. If a woman takes a vow of virginity, canon law binds her to it permanently. There is no mechanism for release except through higher ecclesiastical approval, which the bishop conveniently holds. Imagine swearing chastity at 14 under the promise of salvation, only to regret it at 20. You cannot simply change your mind. You must beg the bishop to absolve you. And what are the chances he will? His interest lies not in your freedom, but in maintaining the prestige of his virgins. The bishop's influence extends to confessional law, where women's sexual sins are catalogued, judged, and punished. Confession is supposed to be a sacrament of healing, but it often functions like surveillance. Women are compelled to speak aloud the most intimate details of their lives to male clerics, who then relay patterns upward to bishops. This means bishops can track not just whether a girl is married, but whether she has been tempted, whether she has kissed, touched, or thought unholy thoughts. The very act of confession transforms the bishop into a custodian of women's bodies, collecting secrets and shaping reputations. Consider also the penalties. Canon law prescribes penance for fallen women, ranging from fasting to flogging, from seclusion to lifelong shame. But for men, particularly clergy, the punishments are lighter, often symbolic. This imbalance doesn't happen by accident. It's baked into the system by making female purity the linchpin of holiness. Bishops ensure that women's bodies remain sites of constant anxiety, fear, and judgment. Every failure strengthens their grip, and because canon law is declared the law of God, resisting it feels like resisting heaven itself. You might imagine medieval towns as noisy, chaotic places where church rules are ignored. But watch closely, and you'll see bishops' influence in every corner. Marriage disputes, settled in ecclesiastical courts. Inheritance battles, often dependent on whether a daughter is a virgin bride or a consecrated nun. Even accusations of adultery or fornication come under church law, meaning the bishop decides not just spiritual, but social outcomes. The web stretches wide, and every thread leads back to the same gilded chair. Inside the bishop's court, women appear not as agents but as cases. Picture a widow dragged before clerks because she remarried too quickly, or a young bride accused of concealing a lack of virginity on her wedding night. Witnesses argue, families mutter, and then the bishop pronounces judgment. His word is final. He decides if her dowry is forfeited, if her children are legitimate, if her soul is endangered. The very definition of truth bends around his interpretation, and with each ruling, the bishop reinforces the idea that women's bodies are legal property to be managed, weighed, and categorized. The bishop's role as spiritual guardian sounds benevolent in theory, but in reality, it is suffocating. When a girl is dedicated as a virgin of God, the bishop becomes her protector. That means he controls where she lives, how she worships, what property she retains, and whom she sees. Families are told this is an honor, that their daughter is under divine shelter, but you see the darker side. It's also a cage. The girl is no longer her own. She belongs to the bishop as much as a field or a flock. One of the cleverest mechanisms is the requirement that bishops inspect convents and female communities. Officially, this ensures discipline and piety. Unofficially, it gives bishops access to women's lives in intimate detail. They decide whether rules are strict enough, whether sisters are obedient enough, whether anyone is showing improper behavior. Imagine a group of women trying to build their own spiritual world only for the bishop to arrive unannounced, demanding entry, demanding control. The rhetoric of guardianship becomes surveillance. When disputes arise, bishops often frame themselves as fathers to virgins, wielding the language of family. But the metaphor is deceptive. A father's love in this system is tied to ownership, not care. Bishops describe virgins as daughters of the church, yet these daughters are not allowed to leave without permission, to speak freely in councils, or to refuse the vows pressed upon them. It's a family where obedience is demanded but compassion is optional. The father figure wears a ring of gold and expects silence. What strikes you most is how normalized all of this becomes. No one thinks it strange that bishops manage women's chastity as if it were a ledger entry. Families bring their disputes willingly, convinced that the bishop's judgment is the voice of God. Women themselves internalize the system, confessing sins that are not sins, apologizing for desires that are natural. The structure works precisely because it convinces everyone that control equals holiness. The bishop doesn't have to force his authority. It seeps into minds until it feels inevitable. At times, this control takes almost absurd forms. Canon law includes detailed discussions on whether a marriage is valid if consummated too soon, or if vows spoken under duress count. Bishops hold debates over the technicalities of virginity, as if purity were a legal contract rather than a lived reality. You might laugh at the scholastic hair splitting. Is a girl still a virgin if she has sinned in thought, but not in deed? But these debates aren't abstract. They decide lives, dowries, inheritances. The bishop's verdict can erase or sanctify a woman's future with a single phrase. And behind the legal precision, you see the pattern. Every rule bends toward reinforcing the bishop's authority. A woman cannot marry without the church. She cannot break vows without the bishop. She cannot confess without placing her secrets in clerical hands. She cannot inherit without demonstrating purity approved by canon law. Layer by layer, her life is encased in a shell designed and guarded by bishops. The message is clear: her body is not hers to govern. The irony, again, is suffocating. The church preaches that God made man and woman in his image, both blessed, both equal in creation, yet the lived reality is that men wield the pen, the pulpit, and the gavel, while women's bodies become contested ground. Bishops claim they are protecting virgins from worldly corruption, but in truth, they are protecting their own power by monopolizing control over women's sexuality. It's not about safeguarding holiness. It's about safeguarding hierarchy. Think of the silence this breeds. If a woman suffers abuse at the hands of clergy, who can she tell? The bishop, who oversees them. If her family resists his demands, who will defend them? The Pope in far-off Rome, who relies on bishops for local control. The law, the court, the church, all are aligned against her. The structure closes like a fist, and inside it, women learn to endure, to comply, to hope that heaven will one day balance the scales that earth never does. By the time you leave the bishop's court, you understand how deep the roots go. Control of women's bodies isn't accidental. It's the foundation of episcopal power. Virginity, chastity, marriage, all are transformed into legal categories, guarded by men who benefit most from the restrictions. The church has turned female life into a juridical puzzle, where every solution funnels through the bishop's authority. And the puzzle, tragically, was designed not to be solved, but to be sustained. As you walk back into the streets, the bells toll once again. Their sound is no longer holy to you. It feels like iron striking chains. Each peal echoes the laws that bind women's bodies, each note a reminder that bishops hold sway, not just over prayers, but over flesh, blood, and freedom. The people bow their heads, murmuring prayers, but you know what those bells are really saying. The bishop decides, the bishop owns, the bishop rules. And so the night settles, the marketplace quiets, and the cathedral looms above you, a fortress of law and fear disguised as sanctuary. You finally see that the question of why bishops took virgins in the name of God cannot be answered without this truth. Canon law handed them the keys to women's bodies, and they used those keys not to free but to lock. You step inside the cathedral on a winter morning, your breath rising in white plumes, and you find yourself pressed into a crowd gathering for a spectacle, unlike any feast or tournament. Today is not the coronation of a king, not the knighting of a squire. It is the consecration of virgins. A hush moves across the nave as candles are lit in hundreds, their flames flickering gold against the cold stone walls. The air smells of beeswax, incense, and damp wool, and somewhere behind the altar, a choir is rehearsing the opening chant. You realize at once, this is no ordinary mass. This is a ritual designed to turn women into living symbols, and the bishop holds the script. The girls themselves are brought in procession. They are young, sometimes barely beyond childhood, dressed in white garments meant to imitate bridal gowns. Their veils fall to their waists, their faces pale with fear, devotion, or both. The crowd watches them with awe, whispering about their families, their dowries, their purity. To the onlookers, this is a moment of triumph. The church has gained new brides of Christ, but if you look closely, you can see the trembling of hands, the stiff shoulders, the way some stumble slightly under the weight of expectation. They are not brides by choice. They are offering. The bishop enters with a procession of clerics, crozier gleaming in torchlight, mitre towering above his head. He moves slowly, deliberately, as though every step carries the weight of heaven itself. People kneel as he passes, and the virgins bow their heads low. The bishop's very presence signals that this ceremony belongs to him. Without his blessing, the ritual is invalid. Without his word, the vow is meaningless. He is both officiant and judge, standing between the women and God like a gatekeeper. The ritual begins with readings from scripture, always chosen to reinforce the symbolism of virginity. Passages from the Song of Songs are recited, lines of longing twisted into allegories of spiritual marriage. The parable of the wise and foolish virgins is read, reminding everyone that only those who guard their lamps of purity are admitted to the heavenly feast. Each verse builds the expectation that these girls are entering into a marriage unlike any other, one where the groom is invisible, but the contract is eternal. And who drafts that contract? The bishop, of course, with his authority stamped onto every syllable. Next comes the litany of saints. One by one, names of female martyrs are sung. Agnes, Lucy, Cecilia, Agatha. The choir chants their virtues, the crowd murmurs their prayers, and the virgins stand motionless, as if being weighed against these legends. The message is clear. You are expected to live as they lived, die as they died if necessary, and your bodies are no longer your own. It is a moment of awe for the crowd, but for the girls, it is a silent binding. Their future has been swallowed by the story of others. At the heart of the ritual lies the vow. Each girl approaches the bishop, kneels, and speaks the words pledging perpetual virginity to God. Her voice may tremble, her eyes may flicker toward her family in the crowd, but the bishop listens intently, then nods his approval. He stretches his hand above her head in blessing, sealing the vow with the weight of his office. From this moment forward, she is consecrated, belonging not to herself or her kin, but to the church, and yet, in practice, belonging to the bishop who enforces and interprets the vow. As part of the consecration, symbolic gifts are bestowed. The virgin receives a veil, marking her separation from worldly desire. She may also receive a ring, signifying her mystical marriage to Christ. Some bishops even place a crown of flowers or gold upon her head, an ironic coronation for a life that will grant her no throne, no kingdom, only confinement within cloister walls. The gestures are moving to the crowd, but you can't help but notice how they mimic secular marriage ceremonies, except the groom is invisible and the bishop acts in his place. The climax of the ritual is the bishop's prayer of consecration. He speaks of purity, sacrifice, and eternal reward, his voice echoing across the stone vaults. The words carry immense power, and the crowd is spellbound, but beneath the beauty lies a grim truth. This prayer locks the virgins into a contract with no exit clause. Unlike earthly marriages, which canon law at least recognizes as dissolvable in rare cases, this spiritual marriage cannot be undone without disgrace. The bishop's words sound like poetry, but they function like chains. When the prayers end, the virgins are led to the altar, where they lie prostrate, their faces pressed to the cold floor while the choir chants. The image is dramatic. Rows of women lying as if already corpses, offered as sacrifices. The bishop stands above them, arms raised, symbol of divine authority. It is both awe-inspiring and unsettling. You realize that the ritual doesn't just consecrate the women, it demonstrates the bishop's dominion over them, visually enacting his role as master of their fate. After the prostration, the virgins rise and take their places in the choir stalls, now marked as separate from ordinary women. The crowd cheers softly, families smile with relief, and donations are discreetly passed to the church. Everyone leaves convinced that a holy act has been performed, that heaven is pleased, but you can see the reality more clearly. A transaction has taken place. Families have secured prestige, the bishop has gained spiritual currency, and the virgins have surrendered their freedom. It is less a wedding than a contract of ownership. The after effects of such ceremonies ripple outward. Families proudly announce their daughter as a consecrated virgin, gaining respect in the community. Convents welcome the women, but always under episcopal supervision, and the bishop records the consecrations in his registers, statistics that bolster his reputation as guardian of holiness. Each virgin consecrated is another mark of his power, another jewel in the crown of his diocese. What looks like a spiritual ceremony is, at its core, a bureaucratic achievement, proof of control exercised and obedience maintained. You might think the girls themselves gain honor and safety from the vow, but life within the convent is often harsh, regulated by rules dictated by bishops and enforced by prioresses loyal to him. The consecrated virgin's identity is reduced to her vow. Her individuality is erased beneath the title of Bride of Christ. And if she falters, if she doubts, if she breaks, the same bishop who blessed her will condemn her as apostate. The ritual is not liberation but a trap disguised as devotion. In some regions, bishops amplified the spectacle, turning consecrations into public theatre. Chroniclers describe ceremonies with processions through streets, trumpets, and feasts. The virgins are paraded like trophies, their purity celebrated not for their sake, but for the bishop's glory. The louder the ritual, the more it reinforces his central role, and the more dramatic the performance, the harder it is for anyone to question whether the virgins truly chose this path or were swept along by pressure and fear. Consider the psychological effect. From the time a girl is small, she hears stories of saints who pledged their virginity and gained eternal crowns. When she sees older girls consecrated in dazzling rituals, the pressure builds. Families whisper, "Perhaps you too will wear the veil." By the time the bishop calls her forward, she feels not freedom, but inevitability. To resist would mean disappointing her family, shaming her community, defying God himself. The ritual is the final step in a long road of grooming, and the bishop orchestrates every turn. And yet, not every consecration ends in silent submission. History preserves stories of women who resisted, who escaped, who denounced the system. Some fled convents, others begged secular lords for protection. A few even wrote letters to the Pope complaining of bishops' overreach. Their voices are faint, often silenced in chronicles, but they exist. They remind you that behind the ritual pomp lay human struggle, fear, and resistance. The ceremony was not always received as holy. It was sometimes experienced as theft. Even so, the institution endured for centuries. The ritual of consecrating virgins became a cornerstone of episcopal authority, reinforcing the notion that bishops controlled the gateway to holiness. It blended theatre, theology, and law into a single performance that left no room for dissent, and each time it was repeated, the cycle deepened. Families offered daughters, bishops received them, and communities bowed in reverence to the spectacle. The ritual didn't just consecrate virgins, it consecrated the bishop's power. As you leave the cathedral after witnessing one such ceremony, you can't shake the image of the girls lying prostrate, veils spread like shrouds, while the bishop towered above them. The crowd cheered, the incense rose, but the silence of the virgins lingered. Their voices were barely heard, their choices barely recognized, yet their lives were now bound forever by a ritual designed and enforced by men. You realize that this too is part of the answer. Bishops took virgins in the name of God because rituals made it look holy, and because rituals silenced those who might resist. The city sleeps, the bells toll, and the cathedral darkens, but the ritual echoes on in memory. For the bishop, it is another victory, another confirmation of his sacred role. For the families, it is another bargain struck. For the virgins, it is a lifetime sealed in vows made on a cold morning before an altar of stone. And for you, it is another glimpse into the machinery of a system that cloaked control in sanctity and turned the most personal human reality into public theatre. You sit in the dim light of the cathedral side chapel, the stone walls damp with centuries of whispered secrets, and you realize that nothing in this world feels more intimate, more terrifying than confession. The wooden screen creaks, the air smells faintly of incense and candle smoke, and across the partition sits a priest, or in important cases, the bishop himself. He leans close, crozier set aside, waiting to hear your soul. And unlike any earthly court, here there are no witnesses, no defenses, no lawyers, only your voice, your conscience, and the ears of a man who claims to speak for God. Confession is sold as mercy, a balm for the guilty heart. The Church insists that by speaking your sins aloud, You free yourself from their weight. But the process also hands over an extraordinary power, the power of knowledge. When young women kneel in these booths, they pour out their fears, their desires, their mistakes, secrets they have never told a soul. The bishop, through his priests, collects these secrets like a treasure hoard, and knowledge, in a medieval world, is worth more than gold. Imagine being a girl of 15, told by your parents that you must confess before Easter. You kneel, knees aching on the stone floor, and whisper through the screen that you once thought impure thoughts, that a boy touched your hand, that you doubted your vow of chastity. To you it is shameful, terrifying, the end of innocence. To the bishop's representative, it is information, evidence of temptation, a sign to be monitored. Multiply that by hundreds of girls across a diocese, and you see how bishops acquire an archive of vulnerability. The process doesn't end with confession. Penance is assigned. Fasting, prayers, vigils, sometimes even physical punishment. The bishop has the authority to decide what discipline is appropriate, and that decision is not just about sin, but about control. A young woman who confesses to minor slips may be ordered to avoid certain company, to stay under watch, to submit to spiritual supervision. Each penance binds her tighter to the church's oversight, making her dependent on episcopal approval for her very sense of worth. And here lies the strange paradox. Confession feels like intimacy, yet it creates dependence. Women are encouraged to see bishops and priests as spiritual fathers, men who know their deepest thoughts and guide them toward salvation. But this intimacy is one-sided. The woman bares her soul, while the bishop conceals his own behind robes and ritual. The asymmetry is staggering. She becomes transparent to him, while he remains untouchable to her. It is vulnerability weaponized. Sometimes the intimacy veers into manipulation. Bishops or confessors may emphasize particular sins, especially those tied to sexuality. A girl may whisper about her curiosity, her desires, her fears, only to have the confessor dwell on them, probe them, interpret them in ways that deepen her shame. The more guilty she feels, the more dependent she becomes on his absolution. It is a cycle as effective as it is cruel. Create guilt, demand confession, assign penance, and repeat. The bishop becomes not just judge, but the very architect of her conscience. Picture the long lines of women on holy days, waiting for confession. They shuffle forward, shawls drawn tight, eyes lowered. Some carry real guilt, others carry only fear of gossip or rumor. Each one leaves lighter or heavier, depending on the words spoken behind the screen. And the bishop's priests take notes, not written perhaps, but remembered. Who falters, who doubts, who resists these patterns reach episcopal ears. Confession doubles as surveillance, keeping the bishop informed about the hidden lives of his flock, especially his virgins. Even outside the confessional, the bishop uses the rhetoric of spiritual intimacy. He presents himself as a shepherd who knows his sheep, a father who guides his daughters. Women are told to trust him more than they trust themselves, to believe his judgment over their own instincts. The result is dependence, so deep that some cannot imagine life without episcopal oversight. Their thoughts, their desires, even their private prayers, are shaped by what they imagine the bishop will approve. It is not just their bodies that are controlled, it is their minds. The confessional also reshapes relationships between men and women. Husbands may urge their wives to confess regularly, ensuring they remain pure. Fathers may demand daughters reveal themselves fully to the bishop. In this way, family life is bound into ecclesiastical authority. Instead of resisting church intrusion, households cooperate with it, feeding women into the cycle of confession and penance. The bishop does not have to knock on doors. Doors are opened for him willingly, because confession is presented as salvation. And you notice how skillfully bishops cloak this surveillance in tenderness. They speak of compassion, of listening, of guiding lost souls. They lower their voices, soften their tones, as if to mimic a mother's care. But underneath lies an iron certainty. The absolution you crave can only come from them. Without their words, your soul remains burdened, your place in heaven uncertain. It is intimacy mixed with coercion, kindness welded to power. You are drawn in not by threats alone, but by the illusion of care. In some cases, bishops themselves step directly into the role of confessor, especially for noble families or consecrated virgins. Imagine a young woman kneeling before him, whispering the most private details of her heart. He leans forward, nods, murmurs prayers, perhaps even offers advice. She feels seen, understood, absolved. But he walks away with something far more valuable: her trust, her secrets, her dependence. Over time, this trust can be twisted into influence, even exploitation, and because it is cloaked in holiness, it rarely faces resistance. Confession also provides bishops with leverage in broader politics. Knowing the sins and weaknesses of influential families gives him an advantage in disputes. If a noble father knows the bishop is aware of his daughter's lapses, he may tread more carefully in negotiations. If a rival lord suspects the bishop holds compromising secrets, he may hesitate to oppose him. What appears to be a purely spiritual practice becomes a political tool, a network of whispered information that strengthens episcopal dominance. The constant focus on sexual sin is especially revealing. Women confess minor curiosities, dreams, even accidental touches, and bishops treat them as evidence of moral peril. This emphasis is not accidental. By defining women primarily through their sexual purity, bishops ensure that confession keeps circling back to the same theme: control of their bodies. The cycle of guilt and absolution makes women perpetually reliant on episcopal guidance, unable to claim innocence without clerical endorsement. And yet, amid this system, there are moments of resistance. Some women confess reluctantly, offering as little as possible. Others delay or avoid confession, risking censure rather than bare their souls. Chroniclers even record instances of women mocking confessors, turning questions back on them. These are rare acts of defiance, quickly silenced, but they show that not everyone accepted the intimacy as natural. Some sensed the imbalance, the danger hidden in the ritual, even if they could not escape it entirely. Over time, confession becomes institutionalized. By the Fourth Lateran Council, in 1215, annual confession is required of every Christian. This universalizes the practice, guaranteeing that bishops everywhere receive a steady stream of intimate secrets. No longer is confession optional or occasional. It is mandatory, binding every woman, every girl, into the cycle of disclosure and dependence. The bishop's ears grow fuller with each passing year, until he holds a kind of power kings can only envy. Power over consciences. You begin to see how confession shapes entire communities. Gossip is rampant in medieval towns, but gossip only hints at truth. The bishop, through confession, knows the truth, or at least believes he does. He can distinguish rumor from reality, sin from suspicion. This knowledge makes him indispensable. Families may bristle at taxes, nobles may resist tithes, but no one can live without confession. To be denied absolution is to be denied heaven itself, and that threat ensures obedience like no army ever could. What chills you most is how ordinary it all feels. People line up, kneel, whisper, cross themselves, and leave, never questioning the structure. Women confess things that are not crimes, not even moral failings, but human experiences: desire, doubt, curiosity. All become sins when spoken aloud, and bishops, sitting at the top of this vast system, gather these human frailties and turn them into tools of control. It is subtle, almost invisible, yet devastating in its reach. By the time you leave the chapel, the sound of whispered confession still echoes in your ears. You remember the trembling voices, the soft responses, the tears wiped hastily away. What looked like a sacrament of healing reveals itself as a mechanism of surveillance, an intimacy designed not to free, but to bind. Women walk out believing they are cleansed, but in truth, they have tied themselves even tighter to the bishop's authority. Their secrets are no longer theirs, and so you understand another piece of the puzzle. Bishops took virgins in the name of God not only through public rituals, but through private intimacy. Confession turned vulnerability into currency, secrets into leverage, purity into dependence. It was not the sword or the law alone that bound women to bishops. It was the whispered trust of the confessional, the illusion of care that masked a system of control. And once spoken, a secret could never be taken back. You follow the bishop beyond the cathedral walls, past the market stalls and into the quieter edge of the city, where stone walls rise enclosing a convent. The iron-studded gates creak open at his command, and you realize that these walls, though cloaked in prayer and silence, are just as political as any castle. Inside lives a community of women, nuns and novices, who are supposedly dedicated to God, yet their lives are shaped, inspected and often disrupted by bishops, whose authority reaches even into cloisters, where men are not supposed to dwell. The convent appears serene at first glance. Sisters chant in the chapel, gardens bloom with herbs, and novices sweep the courtyards in silence. But beneath the surface hums a constant tension. The bishop's visit is always looming. He alone holds the right of visitation, meaning he can arrive unannounced to examine discipline, question the abbess, and interview the sisters. To the outside world, this sounds like protection ensuring holy women remain holy. To the women inside, it feels like surveillance cloaked in ritual. Their prayers may ascend to heaven, but their daily obedience bends toward the bishop. The inspection itself is a performance. The bishop enters with clerks and notaries, carrying parchment and pens. He questions the abbess about finances, discipline and adherence to the rule. He may demand to see the accounts, the food stores, even the living quarters. The sisters line up like school children, answering his questions about obedience and purity. Every sigh, every hesitant pause is noted. The bishop frames it as care for their souls, but the process feels more like an audit. Souls treated like assets, vows treated like contracts, and sometimes the inspections go deeper. The bishop may call individual nuns to private interviews asking about temptations, conflicts, or lapses. A novice might confess that she struggles with her vow, that she longs for the life outside. The bishop listens, nods, and makes a record. But instead of compassion, the result is often stricter discipline, confinement, fasting, or a reminder that breaking vows means eternal shame. The walls close tighter after each inspection. What was once a community of women becomes a colony under surveillance. Financial control adds another layer. Convents rely on donations, dowries from new nuns, and land grants. Bishops oversee these transactions, approving or redirecting funds. A wealthy family may donate land with the condition that their daughter be admitted, but the bishop decides whether the convent accepts. If the abbess resists, he can overrule her. In this way, the bishop becomes not just a spiritual overseer, but a landlord. The convent's survival depends less on its prayers than on episcopal favor, and every transaction adds to his wealth and influence. Conflicts inevitably arise between abbesses and bishops. Many abbesses were powerful women from noble families, used to exercising authority, yet their power is always checked by the bishop's right of intervention. If an abbess grows too independent, a bishop can accuse her of mismanagement or laxity, replace her, or place the convent under stricter supervision. The language of holiness masks a struggle for dominance. Behind the cloister walls, politics play out as fiercely as in any royal court. The politics extend to recruitment as well. Families often sought to place their daughters in prestigious convents, where noble blood might lead to positions of authority. Bishops acted as gatekeepers, determining who was admitted. A family eager for influence might sweeten the process with generous donations, while poorer families begged for mercy. The bishop's decisions shaped not only the convent's population, but also its alliances with powerful households. A virgin consecrated here was not just a bride of Christ, she was a bargaining chip in episcopal politics. Convents themselves sometimes resisted. Records tell of nuns who fought for independence, appealing directly to the Pope to free them from local bishops. Some succeeded, gaining the right to self-govern under papal protection. But these victories were rare, and bishops fought hard to reclaim authority. To lose control of a convent was to lose income, prestige, and symbolic dominance. Bishops justified their interference as spiritual duty, but the stakes were economic and political as much as theological. Daily life inside the convent reflects this dynamic. The rule prescribes hours of prayer, study, and labour, but much of the rhythm is shaped by episcopal mandates. If a bishop orders stricter fasting, the sisters comply. If he demands silence outside of prayer, voices vanish. Even the smallest freedoms, writing letters, receiving visitors, keeping a personal devotional book, may be curtailed at his whim. The convent becomes less a refuge for women and more a testing ground for episcopal control. The irony is that convents were often founded as sanctuaries for women seeking autonomy from marriage or family pressure. Some entered willingly, finding genuine purpose in prayer and scholarship. Yet once inside, their autonomy is undercut by episcopal oversight. They exchange one form of male control, family or husband, for another, the bishops. Freedom is promised at the gate, but inspection ensures it never fully arrives. The bishop's shadow stretches into every corner of their lives. Even the spiritual life of the convent is shaped by episcopal politics. Bishops decide which liturgical texts are permitted, which relics are housed, which saints are venerated. They send confessors to hear the nuns, often chosen from their loyal clerics. Through these channels, the bishop keeps the sisters tethered, not just financially but spiritually. Their prayers may rise to heaven, but their rituals always pass through episcopal hands. In effect, the nuns' devotion is mediated, filtered, and controlled by men outside their walls. Sometimes, this control turns scandalous. Chroniclers whisper of bishops who abused their authority, exploiting their access to convents for personal gain. Some extracted bribes, others indulged in inappropriate intimacy. Still others used convent wealth as their private purse. These scandals rarely saw daylight, silenced by fear and the church's power to suppress dissent. Yet they remind you that the rhetoric of guardianship often masked exploitation. To the outside world, bishops were protectors. To the women inside, they could be predators. And yet, convents were not powerless. Sisters developed strategies of quiet resistance, delaying payments, concealing small freedoms, cultivating networks of support with sympathetic clergy or patrons. Some wrote letters, even treatises, challenging episcopal authority. Their voices may have been marginalized, but they were not silent. Within the walls, women carved out spaces of learning, art, and prayer, keeping alive sparks of independence, even under surveillance. Their resilience complicates the narrative. Bishops dominated, but nuns endured. The bishop's involvement also shaped public perception of virgins. A consecrated nun was admired not only for her piety but for her obedience to the bishop. Families pointed with pride to their daughters in cloister, not because the women were free, but because they were safely enclosed under ecclesiastical control. Society applauded bishops for protecting virgins, ignoring the reality that this protection often meant confinement. The image of holiness served to reinforce episcopal power in the public imagination. When disputes erupted, bishops often used dramatic gestures to enforce authority. Some placed convents under interdict, suspending all sacraments until compliance was achieved. Others threatened excommunication for disobedient nuns. Imagine the terror of women who believed their eternal souls depended on these sacraments, suddenly cut off at the bishop's word. Such tactics remind you that episcopal control was not gentle guidance, but coercion backed by the threat of damnation. The convent walls may have been thick, but they offered no defense against spiritual weapons. You also notice how convent politics tie into broader networks of power. Bishops exchanged favors with nobles, granting privileges in exchange for support. Convents became pawns in these alliances, their wealth and populations manipulated to secure episcopal influence. What looked like spiritual oversight was, in reality, one node in a web of medieval politics. Virgins behind convent walls were not only brides of Christ, they were bargaining pieces in the endless chess game of bishops and lords. Still, there were moments of beauty. Convents produced manuscripts, music, and art, preserving culture in an age of turbulence. Nuns composed hymns, illuminated texts, and even corresponded with scholars, but all of this remained under episcopal gaze. A bishop could suppress a manuscript, forbid a correspondence, or confiscate a relic. Creativity flourished, but always within boundaries drawn by men outside. The brilliance of women's contributions was often dimmed by the shadow of episcopal control. As you leave the convent, the gates close behind you with a heavy clang, and you sense the paradox. Inside are women dedicated to prayer, education, and community. Yet their lives are bound at every turn by the authority of bishops, who claim to protect them but often exploit them. The convent is both sanctuary and prison, both refuge and cage, and the key always rests in the bishop's hand. So you walk back toward the city, the sound of the convent bells fading into the distance, and you understand another piece of the puzzle. Bishops took virgins in the name of God, not only through public rituals and whispered confessions, but also through the politics of convents, their right of inspection, their control of finances, their power over abbesses and novices, all ensured that women who sought freedom in cloisters found instead a different kind of domination. Sanctuary was real, but so was surveillance. The cathedral looms again as you return, and the cycle feels clearer than ever. Virgins may enter willingly, seeking God, but they emerge as symbols of episcopal power, their lives folded into a system that cloaks politics in holiness. And you, standing beneath the bells once more, know that the question of why bishops claimed virgins can never be answered without this truth. Convents, too, were arenas of control, and bishops were always the masters of the game. You wake the next morning to find the cathedral square buzzing again, but this time not with ritual or inspection. It is persuasion at work. A bishop never relies only on force or law. He knows how to sell salvation like a merchant sells wares. Families gather in the shadow of the spire, listening as clerics preach that to surrender a daughter as a holy virgin is to secure treasure in heaven. Salvation is described not as an abstract gift, but as a tangible bargain, and bishops are the ones holding the contract. The promise is seductive. In a world of plague, famine, and endless war, people live with death breathing constantly down their necks. The idea that eternal safety can be secured through a daughter's vow is irresistible. Bishops tap into this fear expertly. They preach that while wealth may burn and armies may fall, a consecrated virgin remains a permanent guarantee before God's throne. Families, trembling at the fragility of life, believe the bishop, robed in gold, becomes not just a shepherd, but a salesman of immortality. You see it clearly during a Sunday sermon. The bishop's voice fills the nave as he paints a picture of the afterlife, the flames of hell on one side, the radiant company of saints on the other. He describes how virgins stand closest to Christ, crowned in eternal light, interceding for their families. Then he looks out at the congregation, pausing just long enough to let fear creep in. "Which of you," he asks, "would deny your daughter the honor of standing forever at his side?" It isn't a question, it's a demand wrapped in rhetoric. The strategy works because salvation is not just individual, but communal. In medieval thought, the fate of one soul affects the entire family. If a daughter is consecrated, her purity spills over into the lives of her parents, siblings, and kin. Bishops exploit this belief, framing virgins as intercessors for their bloodlines. A family may be sinful, greedy, or cruel, but one virgin child redeems them all. It is indulgence by proxy, salvation on installment, and the bishop presents himself as the broker of this divine economy. Even peasants scrape together coins to make such an offering. You overhear a farmer and his wife debating in hushed tones. They cannot feed all their children, but perhaps dedicating one daughter to God will spare them from hunger in the afterlife. They are not motivated by cruelty, but by desperation. The bishop, aware of this, presses harder. He assures them their sacrifice is holy, that heaven smiles upon such devotion. In truth, he gains not just their daughter, but their loyalty, their tithes, their obedience. For wealthier families, the promise of salvation comes with prestige. Nobles who consecrate a daughter gain a reputation for holiness that enhances their standing at court. The bishop amplifies this, praising their sacrifice in public, reminding the community that the family has secured a heavenly advocate. In return, the nobles shower him with donations, relics, and land. Salvation becomes a currency traded at high levels, and virgins are the coins. The bishop, naturally, is the mint. The promises are often embroidered with vivid imagery. Bishops preach that virgins will one day rise in shining garments, leading their families by the hand into paradise. They describe visions of angels singing around these women, carrying their kin across the fiery pit. For listeners who live in constant fear of damnation, these stories are powerful. They create not just belief, but longing. To give a daughter is no longer seen as loss, but as investment in eternal security. The bishop plays on hope as skillfully as he plays on fear. The sermons are reinforced with rituals. On feast days, virgins are paraded through the streets, garlands on their heads, candles in their hands. The bishop blesses them publicly, reminding everyone that these are not ordinary women, but living bridges to heaven. Families watching from the crowd feel the weight of expectation. If others have given their daughters, why haven't you? Salvation becomes competitive, a holy arms race, and bishops reap the benefit. Some families resist, whispering doubts about the harshness of the vow. But the bishop is prepared for this. He warns that withholding a daughter may imperil the entire household. Better, he declares, to give her to God than to risk the eternal fire. The logic is brutal. Choose between a temporary sacrifice now or eternal suffering later. Few dare argue, even if their hearts ache. Parents bow, convinced that to resist is to gamble with their souls. The bishop's rhetoric leaves no middle ground. Behind closed doors, the persuasion is more personal. Bishops visit noble houses, dining at their tables, flattering mothers, reminding fathers of their duty. They hint at favors to come, lighter tithes, political alliances, spiritual privileges. If the family offers a daughter, sometimes promises of salvation are bundled with promises of influence. Heaven and earth are sold in the same bargain, and because salvation cannot be measured or disproved, the bishop's words carry ultimate weight. He is not selling something that can be inspected, he is selling something that can only be believed. What strikes you most is how the virgins themselves are rarely consulted. The decision is framed as a family's holy offering, not an individual's choice. A girl may weep, beg or plead, but the bishop and her parents override her protests with promises of eternal glory. You will save us all, they tell her. Your crown in heaven will shine forever. The burden of salvation is laid upon her shoulders like a cross she never asked to carry. And once consecrated, her resistance becomes sin. The bishop's promises extend beyond the family to the community. Entire towns are told that the presence of consecrated virgins ensures divine favor, good harvests, protection from plague, victory in war. Bishops hold up virgins as shields against God's wrath, claiming that their purity intercedes for all. Villagers, desperate for security in a precarious world, accept this readily. They begin to see virgins not as individuals but as talismans, necessary for survival, and the bishop, controlling the supply, secures loyalty far deeper than taxes ever could. Over time, these promises are recorded in chronicles and hagiographies, cementing the bishop's rhetoric into cultural memory. Stories circulate of families lifted from purgatory because of a daughter's vow, of villages spared by the prayers of virgins. Each tale reinforces the logic: salvation is negotiable, and the bishop is the negotiator. What began as persuasion becomes tradition, and tradition hardens into unquestioned truth. But there are cracks in the system. Some families notice that despite their sacrifices, plagues still come, crops still fail, wars still destroy. Doubt creeps in, though few dare voice it aloud. A peasant mutters, "If giving my daughter brought heaven's favor, why did my son still die?" Yet fear silences dissent. To question the bishop is to risk excommunication, and no one wishes to gamble with eternity. The promises hold, not because they always deliver, but because the cost of disbelief is too high. You watch a mother lead her daughter to the cathedral, tears streaking her face. She whispers that she cannot bear to lose the child, but she also cannot bear to risk damnation. The bishop meets her at the door, assuring her that her sacrifice is holy. He blesses them both, and the crowd murmurs approval. The mother believes she has bought salvation for her family, even as she walks home with one fewer child. The bishop believes he has secured another soul for his ledger. Each convinces themselves of the righteousness of the act. The paradox is glaring. Christianity preaches that salvation is a gift of grace, freely given by God. Yet bishops turn it into a transaction, demanding virgins as payment. Families comply, convinced that their eternal fate depends on obedience. The bishop's role as mediator transforms into that of merchant. He is no longer merely preaching the path to heaven. He is selling tickets at the gate, and the price, more often than not, is a daughter's life. The bells ring again as you leave the square, and you realize how deep the system runs. Promises of salvation are not peripheral. They are the engine driving the surrender of virgins. Fear of hell, hope for heaven, desire for prestige, all are manipulated by bishops who understand the fragility of the human heart. Virgins become the currency of eternity, and bishops the bankers of grace. In a world so uncertain, people cling to any guarantee, even one as costly as this. And so you step into the cold evening, the bishop's words still echoing in your ears. You see clearly now why families yielded their daughters so readily. They believed they were buying eternal safety. The bishop's promises blurred grief into pride, fear into faith, and for centuries, this transaction continued, shaping the lives of countless women whose bodies were surrendered for the salvation of others. The bargain was never fair, but in the medieval mind, it was holy. You return to the bishop's palace and quickly learn that salvation alone never drove the stream of virgins into church hands. Money did. Behind every consecration lies a purse of coins, a deed of land, or a carefully calculated donation. Virginity, in the medieval church, is not just a spiritual asset, it is an economic transaction. And bishops, who control the gate to holiness, also control the coffers that holiness fills. The system begins with dowries. In secular society, a daughter's marriage requires her family to pay a dowry to her husband's household. But when a girl is given to the church, the family is still expected to provide a dowry, except this time the payment goes directly to the convent, which in turn is under episcopal oversight. A father who might balk at marrying his daughter to a poor suitor often sees the church as a safer investment. The bishop assures him the dowry will support the girl's spiritual life, while also swelling the wealth of the diocese. The amounts are staggering. Rich families donate estates, vineyards and mills when consecrating daughters. Even poorer households scrape together livestock or small parcels of land. Each offering, whether humble or grand, enters the church's economic bloodstream. Bishops record these gifts meticulously, knowing that wealth is power and that each consecrated virgin adds not just spiritual prestige, but tangible assets to his dominion. Virginity, it turns out, can be measured in acres and coins. Families justify the expense by believing they are securing both earthly honor and eternal reward. It is cheaper than marrying her into nobility, a merchant mutters, and holier besides. Bishops amplify this logic, reminding parents that every coin offered with their daughter multiplies into heavenly treasure. The bishop's treasury swells, the convent grows richer, and the family enjoys prestige without the risk of dowry disputes with a son-in-law. On parchment, it looks like generosity. In practice, it is profit. The cycle deepens when you notice how bishops redistribute these funds. Part of a dowry supports the convent, but much is redirected into diocesan projects, repairing cathedrals, funding clerics, even financing wars, blessed by the church. A girl's vow of chastity becomes a stone in a cathedral wall or a sword in a knight's hand. Families rarely question this. They trust the bishop's stewardship, but you see clearly that the virgin's life has become not just a spiritual asset, but an economic engine powering the machinery of episcopal ambition. And then there are the donations beyond dowries. Wealthy nobles often sweeten their offerings by giving extra gifts, relics, silks, or entire villages. Bishops encourage this with subtle persuasion. Would not such a holy act deserve a greater gift, they ask. The result is that consecrating a virgin becomes a public display of generosity, a competition among families to prove their devotion. Each donation builds the bishop's power base, tying families more tightly to his influence. Virginity becomes a kind of tax paid in both bodies and gold. Some bishops use this flow of wealth strategically, rewarding loyal families with church privileges or easing their burdens. Others hoard, amassing fortunes that rival secular lords. Chronicles whisper of bishops whose palaces glittered with treasures, funded by virgins' dowries, candlesticks of gold, embroidered vestments. Feasting halls, behind each object lies a girl who vanished into cloister, her vow converted into material splendor. The hypocrisy is blatant, yet hidden beneath incense and chant. For convents, the system is double-edged. Dowries keep their communities alive, providing food, clothing, and books. Without them, many convents would collapse. But the same system ties them irrevocably to bishops, who control the flow of money and land. An abbess may wish to govern independently, but she knows that without episcopal approval, donations will dry up. Thus, even the convent's survival depends on the bishop's economic manipulation of virginity. Peasants see the system in harsher light. A farmer who offers his daughter may surrender his only cow or the deed to a small plot. The bishop blesses the gift, promising eternal reward, but the family left behind often sinks deeper into poverty. They trade survival now for the hope of salvation later, a bargain few would make if not pressed by theology and fear. Yet the bishop accepts their offerings with solemn grace, never admitting how uneven the exchange truly is. Economic incentives also shape politics. A noble who gives a daughter to the church along with lands gains episcopal favor. A rival who refuses risks losing influence. Bishops play these loyalties carefully, distributing privileges, easing taxes, or granting burial rights in prestigious chapels to families who contribute generously. In effect, virgins become tokens in the currency of power, and bishops act as bankers balancing accounts of salvation and politics simultaneously. The wealth derived from virgins extends beyond local economies. Some dowries are so large they finance entire crusades or universities. Bishops boast of their generosity, but you see the irony. The education of young clerics or the arming of soldiers may trace its origin to the sacrifice of a single girl whose family offered her to God. The web of consequence is vast. Virginity doesn't just enrich the church, it fuels the infrastructure of medieval Christendom. Yet the system produces resentment. Documents reveal fathers grumbling about the cost, brothers bitter that land is given away with sisters, communities whispering that bishops grow rich while peasants starve. But complaints rarely bloom into rebellion. To resist is to challenge the promise of salvation and the authority God's representative. Economic exploitation is sanctified, transformed into holy duty. Families sigh, open their purses, and surrender daughters, convinced they are investing in eternity even as they impoverish themselves on earth. You pause at the bishop's treasury, where clerks tally coins and stack parchment deeds. The atmosphere is less sacred than mercantile. Scribes dip quills into ink, recording every transaction with meticulous care. A ledger entry might read, "1 vineyard, given with the vow of Margaret, now Sister Cecilia." The transformation is chillingly bureaucratic, a human life reduced to property lines. To the clerks it is routine. To you it feels like a marketplace disguised as a monastery. Even relics and offerings become entangled. A family might present a jeweled chalice alongside their daughter, hoping the extra gift secures divine favor. The bishop blesses it, places it on the altar, and later enjoys wine from its rim during feasts. The mingling of spiritual and material is seamless, almost invisible. No one in the congregation sees the irony that a virgin's vow helps furnish a bishop's banquet. They see only holiness, and the bishop ensures it stays that way. Sometimes the economic incentives are explicit. Bishops proclaim indulgences, spiritual pardons for those who give generously with their daughters. Offer not only your child but also your treasure, they preach, and heaven will repay you 100-fold. This combination of fear, hope, and financial pressure ensures a steady flow of wealth. Families who might hesitate at surrendering a daughter are coaxed with the promise that her vow will sanctify not only their souls, but their estates. Virginity becomes both sacrifice and investment. The cycle is self-perpetuating. The more wealth bishops acquire from consecrated virgins, the more lavish the ceremonies become. The more lavish the ceremonies, the more families desire the honor of participation. Each consecration fuels the next, and the system grows. What began as a spiritual ideal mutates into an economic machine, humming beneath the hymns and cloisters of the medieval church. And at the center, always, sits the bishop, smiling as the ledger fills. Yet the most tragic aspect is invisible. For every field donated, for every purse of coins surrendered, there is a girl whose life narrows into cloistered walls. Her body becomes the collateral for salvation, her freedom the currency of faith. Families speak of blessings, bishops speak of holiness, but the Virgin herself rarely speaks at all. Her silence is the foundation upon which the entire economic system rests. And silence, once imposed, becomes difficult to break. So you step away from the treasury, the echo of coins still clinking in your ears, and you finally see how deeply economics intertwines with virginity. Bishops took virgins in the name of God, not just because theology allowed it, not just because rituals sanctified it, but because it paid. Land, wealth, and loyalty flowed upward with every consecration. And while families dreamed of salvation, bishops built empires brick by brick, acre by acre, coin by coin. You may have sensed all along that behind the lofty words, the golden rituals, and the promises of salvation, there lurked something darker. By the time you sift through chronicles and complaints, you find proof. Bishops did not only oversee virgins as spiritual guardians, they abused that authority. The same system that clothed them in holiness also gave them access to women with no defense, no voice, no escape, and when temptation struck, many bishops cloaked their actions under the guise of spiritual duty, convincing the world and sometimes even the victims that exploitation was part of God's plan. The stories come from every corner of Christendom. In Visigothic Spain, councils as early as the 7th century issued canons warning bishops not to exploit consecrated virgins. That such laws were needed tells you everything. One decree laments that bishops had been defiling those whom they ought to guard, forcing the church to threaten punishment. The language is stiff, legalistic, but beneath it you hear the muffled cry of scandal. Men entrusted with holiness abusing it for desire. Move forward a few centuries, and you find complaints in Carolingian Francia. Monks record with bitterness how bishops visited convents too freely, inquiring into discipline with a zeal that raised suspicion. Some chronicles speak bluntly. Virgins became prey. Abbesses wrote letters to higher authorities begging protection, insisting that their communities were harassed by bishops who claimed visitation rights. These weren't whispered rumors, but formal grievances, inked onto parchment and preserved in archives. The evidence shows the abuse was systemic, not exceptional. And then there are the whispered scandals of the High Middle Ages, when bishops grew wealthy, politically powerful, and insulated from scrutiny. Chronicles tell of bishops keeping mistresses within convent walls, disguising them as servants. Some allegedly fathered children with women who had once taken vows of chastity. The hypocrisy was flagrant, but who could challenge them? Their word was law, their authority divine. If a girl protested, her reputation was ruined. If a family resisted, they risked excommunication. Silence was safer, and silence allowed the abuse to flourish. The exploitation was often dressed in the language of piety. A bishop might summon a virgin under the pretext of confession, urging her to reveal every detail of her temptations. He might then counsel her privately, claiming that physical closeness would help her resist sin. To outsiders, it was pastoral care. To the victim, it was entrapment. The power imbalance was total. She was taught to see him as God's representative, while he saw her as an opportunity hidden behind robes and incense. Convents became especially vulnerable. Bishops had the right to inspect, and with that right came access. Chronicles describe how some bishops demanded private audiences with novices, lingering under the excuse of testing obedience. A novice who refused could be accused of rebellion against holy authority. Others were pressed into silence by threats of damnation. If you resist God. The words turned exploitation into sacrilege, leaving women trapped between fear of the bishop and fear of hell. Communities noticed, though few spoke openly. Satirical poems and folk tales from the period mock holy men who chased after virgins, a form of resistance veiled in humour. Some stories tell of bishops slipping into nunneries at night, their croziers left outside like a mocking signal. Laughter becomes the only safe protest. Behind the jokes, however, lies real pain, real violation, recorded obliquely because direct accusation was too dangerous. The people knew, but the system silenced them. There are, however, occasional explosions of truth. In England, Archbishop Thomas Becket clashed with King Henry II, partly over accusations that bishops ignored clerical abuses. In other regions, reform councils in the 11th century thundered against fornication with nuns and virgins. They named no names but condemned the pattern, proof that it was widespread enough to require official rebuke. Each council decree is a crack in the facade, a moment when the church admitted its shepherds had become wolves. One particularly grim account comes from Italy in the 12th century, where a bishop was accused of maintaining a secret house of women under the guise of a religious retreat. Chronicles say he forced virgins into service, threatening them with curses if they resisted. When locals finally complained, the case reached Rome, but the bishop was quietly moved to another diocese, his sins washed away by political necessity. The women remained silenced, their suffering hidden beneath the church's refusal to tarnish its own image. And yet, even as scandals erupted, bishops maintained their spiritual aura. They preached purity from pulpits, while committing its opposite in chambers. They condemned laymen for fornication while indulging in it themselves. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but effective. People could not reconcile the man they saw at Mass with the rumours they whispered in taverns. And because disbelief risked damnation, they chose faith over doubt, even when the evidence was before their eyes. You can't help but notice the psychological manipulation at play. Girls were taught that their virginity was God's greatest treasure, that to lose it outside marriage or vow was to court eternal ruin. When the very guardian of that treasure exploited them, confusion reigned. Some internalized guilt, believing they had sinned, even though they were coerced. Others clung to silence, convinced no one would believe them against a bishop. The abuse was not just physical, but spiritual, corroding the very faith that made resistance impossible. The economic incentives you witnessed earlier intertwine here. A family who had donated land with their daughter's consecration was unlikely to protest her mistreatment. To do so would risk losing both property and prestige. Bishops understood this. By binding families economically, they ensured complicity. Virginity was not only silenced by fear, but also by investment. Too many households had too much to lose. The bishop's sin became a shared secret, borne by the community's reluctance to expose him. At times, reformers pushed harder. The Gregorian reform of the 11th century targeted ceremony and clerical marriage, but it also addressed sexual misconduct. Polemicists thundered against bishops who corrupted virgins in the name of God. Their rhetoric is fiery, filled with anger, yet frustratingly vague. They condemn the sin but rarely name the sinners, a pattern that allowed bishops to slip away unscathed. The institution admitted guilt, abstractly while protecting individuals concretely. Still, names occasionally surface. In the 13th century, chroniclers accuse Bishop Adam of Coutances of scandal with nuns. Bishop Manasses of Reims faced charges of keeping mistresses. These cases, though rare, show the pattern stretched across regions and centuries. Bishops were not merely tempted, they acted, repeatedly exploiting the very virgins they claimed to sanctify. The abuse was not an accident, but a risk baked into the system of unchecked authority. And what of the virgins themselves? Their voices are faint but audible in fragments of letters, testimonies, and chronicles. Some describe themselves as ravished by wolves in shepherd's clothing. Others speak of betrayal, of losing both innocence and faith at the hands of those they trusted most. Their words cut through centuries like knives, shattering the church's polished image. They remind you that behind every abstract decree, every whispered rumor, there was a human life scarred by abuse. Communities sometimes erupted when the scandal grew too obvious. In a few towns, mobs rose against bishops, accusing them of corruption. Convents shut their gates, refusing episcopal visits. Laypeople demanded These moments are rare but powerful, evidence that even in a world steeped in obedience, outrage could break through. Yet too often the response was silence, transfer, or cosmetic reform. Bishops survived, virgins endured, the system bent, but did not break. By now, you see the tragic pattern clearly. Authority unchecked breeds exploitation. Virginity, exalted as holy, becomes the very bait used by predators. Bishops claim to protect, but instead consumed, all while cloaking themselves in scripture and ceremony. And because their power was both spiritual and political, few dared to hold them accountable. The result was a cycle of abuse that scarred countless women while preserving the bishop's gilded image. As you leave the records behind, you feel a heaviness settle in your chest. The incense, the bells, the promises of salvation, all seem tainted now by the knowledge of what lay beneath. Bishops took virgins in the name of God, not only through law, ritual, and persuasion, but through outright exploitation. They turned spiritual intimacy into coercion, guardianship into predation, holiness into hypocrisy, and while councils condemned, chronicles whispered, and communities joked, the abuse persisted, protected by silence and sanctity alike. The cathedral bells toll again, as if trying to drown out the past, but you know better. Their echoes carry both glory and shame, both holiness and sin, and in those echoes you hear the truth. The abuse of authority was not an aberration. It was part of the system itself, woven into the fabric of a world where bishops stood unchallenged at the crossroads of power, and virgins were left defenseless beneath their shadow. You have now seen how bishops exploited their power, but the deeper question remains: why did communities allow it? Why did families hand over daughters? Why did abbesses yield? Why did entire villages bow their heads in silence, even when abuses were whispered in every corner? The answer is as chilling as it is revealing. Silence was not an accident, but a cultural reflex. Complicity became survival, and survival required obedience. Start with fear. In medieval Europe, excommunication was not just a church penalty, it was social death. To be cut off from sacraments meant you could not marry, could not be buried in consecrated ground, could not share in the rituals that knit community together. People believed it endangered their very souls. Bishops held the power to impose this punishment, sometimes casually, sometimes strategically. Families who resisted episcopal demands risked not only disgrace but eternal damnation. Against such stakes, silence felt safer than protest. Then add the weight of theology. From cradle to grave, people were taught that bishops were successors of the apostles, voices of God on earth. To question them was to question Christ himself. Even when contradictions were obvious, faith demanded deference. Sermons hammered the point home. Obedience leads to salvation. Rebellion invites hellfire. Communities internalized this so deeply that even when they saw injustice, they translated it into mystery. God must have his reasons, they muttered. Doubt was rebranded as sin. Social hierarchy reinforced the silence. In a world where peasants bowed to lords, wives obeyed husbands, and children deferred to parents, resistance was alien. Bishops slotted neatly into this structure, towering above, as both spiritual and temporal lords. Their palaces resembled castles, their retinues resembled courts, and their authority echoed that of kings. If you dared to oppose them, who would support you? Neighbors? Nobles? More often than not, those same figures depended on episcopal favor themselves. The hierarchy was a web, and the bishop sat at its center. Communities also gained from complicity. To have a consecrated virgin in town brought prestige. Villages boasted of their holy daughters, hoping their prayers would shield the fields from famine and the homes from plague. Bishops encouraged this thinking, praising communities that offered virgins as especially blessed. And so, even if whispers of abuse circulated, people hushed them. They feared losing their holy shield. Better to protect the bishop's reputation than to risk God's displeasure. The economics you saw earlier played into this silence. Families had invested land, coin, and livestock alongside their daughters. To admit exploitation was to admit waste. to confess they had traded dearly for a lie. Pride prevented such acknowledgement. They told themselves their sacrifice remained holy, even if their daughters suffered. Communities too benefited from episcopal wealth. Roads built, markets blessed, festivals funded. The bishop's prosperity spilled over just enough to quiet complaints. Silence was not free, but it was profitable. Even abbesses and nuns, those closest to the abuse, often chose complicity. Some feared the wrath of bishops, knowing their convents depended on his favour. Others rationalised, convincing themselves that enduring mistreatment was itself a form of holy suffering. In a culture that glorified martyrdom, silence could be rebranded as sacrifice. A nun who endured quietly was praised as patient. One who protested risked being branded rebellious, even sinful. The very language of virtue was twisted into a cage. You might wonder whether rumours ever burst into open scandal. Sometimes they did, but cultural reflex quickly dampened the flames. When communities gossiped about bishops, the stories often shifted into satire or allegory. Poets joked about fat clerics chasing skirts. Chroniclers wrote of wolves in shepherd's clothing. Humour allowed truth to circulate while keeping it toothless. People laughed, shook their heads, and returned to obedience. The jokes vented anger without changing the system. Fear of hell sealed the silence. Bishops exploited theology ruthlessly, warning that to accuse a consecrated guardian was itself a grave sin. A woman who spoke out risked being branded a liar, her soul imperiled. Families who defended her could be shamed as enemies of the church. Imagine a young virgin whispering that the bishop had touched her. How quickly would neighbours dismiss it as delusion or temptation? Better to assume she sinned than to believe the shepherd strayed. Faith made silence easier than truth. Communities also lacked channels of justice. Secular courts hesitated to challenge bishops, whose authority overlapped with kings. Papal courts were far away and costly to petition. Most people lived and died within a few miles of their village. The idea of challenging a bishop in Rome was unthinkable. With no path upward, silence spread sideways. Neighbours consoled each other, families whispered warnings, but no one broke the circle. Justice was impossible, so silence became the default. The psychology of complicity was subtle. Many convinced themselves that what they saw or heard was exaggerated. If a girl vanished into a convent, perhaps she truly wanted it. If a bishop grew close to a virgin, perhaps it was spiritual intimacy. People clung to explanations that preserved order. Chaos was more frightening than corruption. To believe the bishop was guilty threatened the entire fabric of meaning. If God's representative was false, then what hope remained? Better to believe in holiness than to face despair. At times, bishops actively rewarded silence. Families who cooperated were granted privileges, lighter tithes, or better seats in church. Those who whispered too loudly found themselves burdened with fines, public penance, or social isolation. Communities learned quickly which path was safest. The carrot dangled as close as the stick cracked, and soon silence wasn't just imposed, it was chosen, because obedience paid. Consider also the power of spectacle. Consecration ceremonies dazzled crowds, cloaking exploitation in pageantry. Who could believe the bishop guilty when he stood at the altar, arms raised, surrounded by choirs? The sheer beauty of the ritual smothered suspicion. People left uplifted, convinced they had witnessed holiness. Memory of abuse was blurred by incense and chant. The bishop knew the power of performance, and performance kept communities complicit. You see complicity most clearly in chronicles. When scandals are mentioned, they are softened, names omitted, details vague. Writers feared offending patrons or church censors, so the truth is buried in euphemisms. The bishop strayed, discipline was lacking, rumours abounded. These phrases conceal more than they reveal. Silence doesn't only live in the mouths of peasants, it lives in the pens of historians, ensuring future generations inherit only shadows. Yet silence was not always cowardice. For many it was survival. To resist a bishop could mean ruin, loss of livelihood, imprisonment, even violence. Families already battered by famine or plague had no energy for rebellion. Women already voiceless in law and politics had no platform for protest. Silence became a shield, a way of enduring. Complicity wasn't always belief. Sometimes it was the only way to live another day. Still, complicity left scars. Daughters who vanished into convents, women who suffered in silence, families who swallowed their grief. These wounds festered. Communities carried them quietly, passing them down in stories told by firelight, whispered with sorrow, but never shouted with anger. The silence did not erase the pain, it only buried it deeper. And generations later, those stories still carry the weight of complicity. By the end of the Middle Ages, reformers began to question this silence. Some dared to speak openly, demanding stricter oversight of bishops, condemning their abuses, but centuries of complicity had already entrenched the system. For every critic, there were dozens who defended the status quo, insisting that obedience mattered more than justice. The culture of silence had become its own theology, as holy in the minds of many as virginity itself. As you leave the village square, you finally understand why the question, "Why did bishops take virgins in the name of God?" has such a haunting answer. It was not only because bishops desired power, or because rituals allowed it, or because money fueled it. It was also because communities allowed it, through fear, faith, hierarchy, economics, and survival. Silence was the mortar that held the system together. Without it, the walls might have cracked. With it, they endured for centuries. The bells toll once more, echoing across rooftops, and you hear them differently now. They are not only calls to prayer, they are reminders of complicity. Each chime says, the community obeyed, the family submitted, the virgins vanished and no one spoke. The silence was louder than any cry, and it is that silence that made the bishop's authority absolute. You've seen how silence protected bishops, but silence was not the only glue holding their power. Politics played its part, and in the medieval world, few things were more political than daughters. Families treated them as bargaining chips, and bishops sitting between throne and altar welcomed those chips with open hands. Virgins were not only holy offerings, they were strategic offerings, tokens placed on the board to secure alliances with the church. And in this chess game, the bishop always played king. Imagine a noble family with ambitions to secure their lands against rivals. They know swords will help, but swords rust, blessings endure. So they approach the bishop, hinting that their daughter might be given as a consecrated virgin. The bishop smiles, assures them their name will be remembered in heaven, and subtly promises favors on earth. Lighter tithes, church support in disputes, maybe even a letter to the king in their defense. The girl, silent beside her parents, becomes the seal of the bargain. It is not only nobles who play this game. Wealthy merchants, eager for legitimacy in a society that prizes noble birth, also consecrate daughters. One merchant offers his second child, along with a new chapel for the cathedral. In return, the bishop praises his family publicly, lifting them into local esteem. Suddenly, doors open in guilds, alliances form with lesser knights, and the merchant's influence grows. His daughter prays behind convent walls, but her presence there is less about her piety than about his ambition. The church itself encourages this politicization. Bishops publicly extol families who surrender daughters, framing them as paragons of devotion. Chronicles record these consecrations with reverence, but you can read between the lines. The praise is political currency. A family so honored gains credibility, allies, and protection. Their rivals cannot easily challenge them, for to do so would seem to challenge holiness itself. Virgin daughters become shields as well as pawns, guarding their family's reputation with a vow. You watch a consecration and notice who attends, not just peasants and neighbors, but nobles, guildmasters and local officials gather. They nod, exchange glances, whisper about alliances. The ceremony doubles as a political theatre. Families are not only offering daughters to God, they are pursleying loyalty to the bishop in front of rivals. To abstain from such gestures risks marginalization. To participate secures a place in the bishop's good graces, and through him, in the larger web of medieval politics. The logic runs deeper when wars flare. Families who support the bishop militarily often sweeten the relationship by offering daughters. In return, the bishop blesses their banners, legitimizes their claims, and perhaps even mediates disputes in their favor. Virgins thus become diplomatic gifts, woven into strategies of survival. Each consecration is both spiritual and tactical, another move in the endless negotiation of power between nobles, kings, and the church. Kings themselves understand the game. Royal daughters are sometimes dedicated to convents, a gesture that binds the monarchy to the church while neutralizing potential threats to succession. A princess behind cloister walls cannot marry into rival houses, but she can serve as a perpetual symbol of royal piety. The bishop, of course, presides over her consecration, basking in the reflected glow of royal sanctity. The alliance is sealed not only with parchment, but with the body of a virgin child. The political use of virgins also stretches across regions. Families seeking papal favor may first prove loyalty to their local bishop. With such offerings, bishops in turn present themselves in Rome as guardians of Flushing convents, rich with noble daughters. Each layer builds upon the next, until the Pope himself is impressed. At every stage, virgins are currency, traded up the chain of power, their vows turned into stepping stones for families and bishops alike. Even rivalries among bishops exploit this pattern. A bishop boasting many consecrated virgins in his diocese can claim greater holiness, influence, and prestige than his peers. Families know this and choose their alliances carefully. To dedicate a daughter to one bishop rather than another signals loyalty, cementing political factions. The virgin's life may narrow to prayer, but her vow radiates outward like a banner declaring allegiance in the battlefield of church politics. You notice how this turns family ambition into community expectation. Villagers pressure local elites to offer daughters, knowing it secures privileges for the whole region. When one lord consecrates his child, others feel compelled to follow, lest they appear less devoted. Bishops exploit this rivalry, praising each new offering more lavishly than the last. Soon, consecrating daughters becomes as much about status competition as salvation. Virgins are not simply given, they are displayed, a family's spiritual trophy. Consider the fate of the girls themselves. Some may embrace the vow sincerely, believing they serve God, but many are swept along by their family's ambitions. A daughter who hesitates risks shaming her kin, undermining political plans carefully laid. Her silence is demanded not only by theology, but by strategy. She carries the burden of her family's reputation, bound tighter by politics than by chains. In this world, resistance is treachery not just to God but to one's own blood. The bishop's role as mediator intensifies the cycle. He presents himself as neutral, above politics, guiding souls for God. Yet every consecration strengthens his influence, deepens his ties to families, and expands his network of loyalty. The virgin may believe she is marrying Christ, but in practice, she has been married off to the bishop's political machine. His power grows with every vow, and no family forgets that their honor depends on his favor. Political alliances through virgins also stabilize dioceses. Families who might otherwise feud are united by shared investment in the church. Two rival lords may glare across fields, but if both have daughters in the bishop's convent, their disputes soften under episcopal arbitration. The bishop uses this leverage deftly, reminding them that their daughters pray side by side, interceding for both households. Virgins thus become peacemakers, not by their own choice, but by the political utility of their captivity. Sometimes the game backfires. A family that gives too many daughters risks weakening its lineage, leaving fewer heirs to inherit lands. Rivals exploit this, mocking their generosity as foolishness. But even then, the bishop benefits, for land tied to virgin vows often reverts to church control. The family may fade, but the diocese flourishes. Virgins once again serve as pawns sacrificed on the chessboard of power. Their loss is the bishop's gain. It's tempting to see this as cynicism alone, but medieval families often believed sincerely in the sanctity of their gifts. They were convinced their daughters' vows brought salvation and prestige in equal measure. The tragedy lies in the overlap. piety and politics feeding each other until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The bishop thrived in this ambiguity, presenting himself as both Holy Father and political broker, his authority reinforced by the silent presence of virgins behind cloister walls. You can almost hear the conversations whispered in noble halls. If we give Margaret, the bishop will support our claim. If we dedicate Anne, the cathedral will honour our name. These negotiations reduced daughters to bargaining chips. Their fates decided over wine and parchment. They rarely speak in these councils. Their silence is assumed, their compliance expected. The political game is played by men, but the cost is borne by women, and the cost is permanent. Once consecrated, a virgin cannot return. Families may regret, daughters may grieve, but the alliance stands. Bishops know this, and they exploit the finality. A broken political treaty can be renegotiated, but a consecrated virgin is forever. Her permanence ensures the bishop's leverage endures, binding families long after short-term politics shift. In this way, the bodies of women become anchors holding the church's alliances in place. So as you walk away from yet another consecration, you see not only ritual, but strategy. Each vow is a move on the chessboard, each virgin a piece maneuvered for gain. Families bow, bishops bless, communities cheer, but beneath the piety lies politics, raw and ruthless. Bishops took virgins in the name of God, not merely for holiness, but for alliances, weaving networks of loyalty that stretched across kingdoms, and in that web, the virgins themselves were the strands, unseen yet binding everything together. You've watched how politics turned virgins into pawns, but the politics alone could not sustain the system. Words did. Sermons and literature became the scaffolding that propped up bishops' control, wrapping exploitation in the shimmering veil of sanctity. If a bishop wanted families to surrender daughters, if he wanted virgins to submit quietly, he needed more than law and ritual. He needed story, and so he preached. He commissioned poems, he circulated treatises, all telling the same tale, that virginity was not loss but mystical gain, not captivity but the highest freedom. The sermons are dazzling. Picture a bishop in his pulpit, voice rolling like thunder across the nave. He declares that virgins are brides of Christ, their vows a wedding ceremony with the divine. He paints heaven as a banquet hall, where consecrated women sit closest to the bridegroom. Clothed in light, parishioners listen, enraptured, and daughters feel both fear and allure. The metaphor is seductive. Instead of being denied marriage, they are told they have the best husband of all. Yet the bishop stands as efficient, the earthly broker of this mystical union. Literature amplifies the same theme. Hagiographies of virgin martyrs flood monasteries and cathedrals, retelling stories of women like Agnes and Cecilia who refused earthly suitors for Christ. These texts are copied, read aloud, painted into stained glass. The message is relentless. Virginity is heroic, mystical, and holy. Bishops use these stories as weapons of persuasion, quoting them in sermons to prove that consecration is not just acceptable, but exalted. Behind the stories you see their purpose, to make obedience feel like glory. The mystical marriage metaphor becomes central. Bishops preach that when a virgin takes her vow, Christ himself places a ring on her finger, crowns her head, embraces her soul. Families weep with pride, imagining their daughters lifted into celestial unions. But of course, the ritual is officiated by bishops, the ring placed by their hand, the crown lowered by their authority. The invisible Christ may be groom, but the visible bishop is matchmaker, officiant, and gatekeeper. Mysticism becomes the cloak for his control. Sermons also serve practical ends. Bishops emphasize that virgins bring blessings, not only to themselves but to their kin. A consecrated daughter, they say, prays day and night for her parents' souls, ensuring their salvation. Literature reinforces this with vivid imagery, visions of virgins leading their families by hand into heaven. These tales stir the hearts of parents, pushing them towards surrender. Words work where swords cannot, persuading people that sacrifice is privilege. What strikes you is how repetitive the language becomes. Sermons, hymns, and treatises all circle back to the same phrases: bride of Christ, garden enclosed, lamp unquenched, temple of the Spirit. The repetition drums the idea into the medieval mind until it feels like truth itself. Daughters hear it from childhood, women hear it at feasts, men hear it in courts. Virginity becomes the air everyone breathes, normalized through constant echo, and bishops are the ones orchestrating the chorus. The literature is not neutral, it is propaganda. Bishops sponsor poets and preachers to craft texts that glorify virginity while quietly justifying their own authority. Manuals for nuns emphasize obedience to episcopal oversight. Prayers for virgins include petitions for bishops' protection. Even hymns intertwine the two, praising Christ while acknowledging the bishop's role as guardian. The mysticism is real enough, but it is always tethered to episcopal control, ensuring no virgin forgets whose hand placed the veil. Consider the allegories woven into sermons. Bishops compare virgins to castles defending the church, gardens protected from beasts, lamps guiding the faithful. In each allegory, a protector is required, and that protector is the bishop. Without him, the castle falls, the garden is ravaged, the lamp extinguishes. The message is subtle but clear. Virginity is holy, but only if supervised. Mystical marriage may elevate women in theory, but in practice, it cements dependency. At feast days dedicated to virgin saints, bishops magnify the message. They retell martyr stories with embellishments, focusing on the women's refusal of earthly husbands. The crowd gasps as Agnes chooses death over marriage, as Cecilia sings hymns while awaiting execution. The point is hammered home. If these saints chose Christ over men, how much holier is it to dedicate daughters to the church? The bishop's sermon transforms martyrdom into marketing, using blood-soaked legends to recruit new brides of Christ. You notice how sermons also defend bishops themselves. Critics may whisper about episcopal abuses, but from the pulpit, bishops cast themselves as guardians of purity. They remind listeners that their authority comes from apostolic succession, that they are fathers caring for spiritual daughters. Literature reinforces this image, depicting bishops as shepherds protecting lambs, teachers guiding maidens, fathers blessing brides. The irony is sharp, but the propaganda works. Communities are conditioned to see bishops not as predators but as protectors, no matter the reality. The mystical marriage metaphor even reshapes language. Families no longer say, "We lost our daughter to the convent, but she married Christ." The phrasing transforms absence into pride, grief into glory. A girl who vanishes behind cloister walls is not stolen, she is exalted. Bishops ensure this vocabulary circulates, teaching priests, monks, and parents to repeat it. Language itself becomes complicit, leaving no room for doubt or sorrow. If Christ is groom, who dares lament? Literature aimed at virgins themselves is equally manipulative. Handbooks instruct them to imagine Christ as a husband who caresses their souls, to think of themselves as queens in heaven's palace. The imagery is tender, intimate, and alluring, but it also ensures that women redirect natural desires into sanctioned fantasies, all under episcopal direction. Their longing is not extinguished, but channeled, bound to the bishop's oversight. Mystical intimacy replaces human freedom, and words make the chains feel like jewels. Preachers even weave humor into their appeals, ensuring the message lodges deep. A bishop jokes that earthly husbands grow bald and weary, but Christ never ages. The congregation laughs, tension eases, and the lesson sticks. Better a mystical husband than a mortal one. Humor disarms resistance, making ideology palatable. The joke lingers long after the sermon ends, reinforcing obedience through laughter. Some literature grows more elaborate, blending mysticism with politics. Poems describe virgins as jewels in the bishop's crown, stars adorning the diocese. Chronicles celebrate bishops who fathered many brides of Christ, a phrase that cloaks control in poetic sheen. Each word serves dual purposes, inspiring devotion while inflating episcopal prestige. When virgins are praised, bishops bask in reflected glory. Their reputations grow not from their own holiness, but from the lives they claim as holy. The psychological effect is immense. Girls raised on such stories internalize them deeply. They dream not of weddings or children, but of mystical unions painted in sermons. When the bishop calls, they respond with resignation or even eagerness, believing they fulfill destiny. Literature has prepared them. Sermons have softened them. Hymns have celebrated them. Their silence is not only coerced, it is cultivated, shaped by years of rhetorical grooming. Yet, cracks appear in the facade. Some women leave behind writings that question the system. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen exalt virginity, but also challenge bishops, insisting that true marriage to Christ transcends human authority. Their voices remind you that not all accepted the bishop's rhetoric. Still, these exceptions prove the rule. They stand out precisely because so many others were silenced by literature designed to prevent dissent. So you step out of the cathedral, your ears still ringing with echoes of the sermon. The words linger, as sticky as incense, as heavy as stone. You realize that bishops took virgins in the name of God, not just through force, law, or politics, but through words crafted, repeated, sanctified, until no one could imagine another truth. And in those words the bishop's power was secured, as surely as if they had built another wall of stone. You might have thought the bishop's words, their rituals, their politics, and their wealth could protect them forever. For a long while, it seemed so, yet history, stubborn as it is, always leaves cracks. Every so often a scandal erupted, an abuse too blatant, a rumour too loud, a community too angry, and the bishop's mask slipped. Exposures came not as a flood, but as scattered flashes, enough to reveal the shadows beneath the mitre. And each time it happened, the church scrambled to contain the fire, even while pretending to douse it with holy water. Take the early councils in Spain and Gaul. By the 7th century, bishops were already being warned against violating the virgins entrusted to them. The very fact that councils wrote such laws is itself evidence. Abuses were rampant enough to require official condemnation. These decrees do not name names, they rarely did, but their stiff legalistic tone hides a scandal just beneath the ink. Someone somewhere had done exactly what the law now forbade, and the church needed to whisper its disapproval before others shouted louder. Move to the Carolingian era, where scandals began spilling into chronicles. Writers complain of bishops keeping women in their houses under the pretense of guardianship. The language is cautious, yet the meaning is clear. Some bishops claim to protect virgins, while instead keeping them as concubines. Monks grumbled, abbesses fumed, and reformers scribbled notes of outrage. The pattern grew familiar: exposure, denial, a council decree, and then silence again. The bishop might be chastised, but rarely stripped of office. By the 11th century, reformers in the Gregorian movement thundered openly. They accused bishops not only of simony and corruption, but of defiling virgins under their care. Polemicists wrote with fury, condemning the hypocrisy of men who preached chastity while violating it. Some pamphlets spread so widely they reached villages, fueling whispers that bishops were wolves in shepherd's clothing. Rome reacted with bluster, summoning councils, issuing decrees, but the deeper problem remained. The fact that so many had to shout proved how many were guilty. One scandal stands out in Reims. Chroniclers record how Bishop Manasses II in the 11th century was accused of simony, violence, and keeping mistresses, though not every detail survives. The charges included exploiting women under his spiritual authority. The Pope eventually deposed him, a rare case where consequences were real. Yet even in disgrace, his story shows how high a bishop could rise, and how far he could fall when his vices grew too visible. England offers another tale. In the 13th century, chroniclers accused Bishop Adam of Coutances of scandalous relations with women. His reputation spread so widely that satirists mocked him in poems. Though he escaped outright deposition, his name endured in shame. Such exposures were rare, but when they surfaced, they revealed what everyone already suspected. The guardians of purity were often its greatest violators. Italy, too, had its whispers turned into roars. One account tells of a bishop who established a house of retreat for virgins, ostensibly a safe haven. Instead, it became his personal harem. When word spread, outrage boiled. Communities complained to Rome, and eventually the bishop was moved quietly to another diocese. No punishment, just relocation. The women were silenced, their suffering buried beneath the church's need to preserve appearances. It was exposure without justice, a pattern as common as it was cruel. Scandals often emerged through satire. In France, fabliaux, comic tales told in rhyme, mocked corrupt clergy chasing after virgins. The jokes were bawdy, irreverent, and wildly popular. Everyone laughed, but the humor bit deep. People knew these stories were rooted in reality. Laughter became the only safe form of exposure. Instead of trials, the bishop faced mockery. His dignity eroded in the taverns even as his authority endured in the cathedral. Reformers sometimes used scandals as fuel. Bernard of Clairvaux thundered against bishops who lived luxuriously, surrounded by women under the guise of pious service. He stopped short of naming specific names, but his fiery sermons stirred outrage. For a moment the mask slipped, yet even Bernard's words could not fully dismantle the system. Bishops accused of scandal often survived, shielded by wealth, allies, and the church's fear of public shame. The papacy itself sometimes intervened, but cautiously. Rome needed bishops to maintain control in distant lands, and removing too many risked weakening the hierarchy. So investigations were slow, punishments lenient. A bishop accused of exploiting virgins might be summoned, scolded, and reassigned rather than deposed. The women's voices rarely mattered. The institution cared more about stability than justice, more about preserving authority than cleansing it. Communities learned to read between the lines. When a bishop suddenly left his post, when Rome announced vague charges of misconduct, people understood. The whispers spread. He defiled the virgins, yet without names in official decrees, the truth dissolved into rumor. The church managed the scandal by controlling the narrative, ensuring exposure never burned too hot. Virgins might have been exploited, but the bishop's image, at least officially, remained largely intact. Still, some exposures shook dioceses deeply. In one German city, townspeople rioted after learning their bishop kept mistresses drawn from convents. The outrage forced secular lords to intervene, demanding reform. For a brief moment, lay people's voices pierced the silence, yet the bishop retained office after promising repentance, and the cycle resumed. Outrage burned, but power endured. Scandals revealed corruption, but exposure rarely broke the system. The chronicles you read drip with cautious language. Writers avoid explicit accusations, but fill their lines with hints. The bishop kept company unbecoming. His house was filled with women. The virgins under his care were not safe. The ambiguity is deliberate. Chroniclers knew the danger of naming sins too directly, yet their evasions only sharpen your sense of the truth. The shadows are thick enough that you can see the outline of the wolf even if they never draw its teeth. At times, reformers used exposure to push wider agendas. Critics of clerical marriage pointed to scandals with virgins as proof that celibacy rules were broken. Political rivals accused bishops of abuse to discredit them in disputes. In these cases, virgins became pawns again, this time in the battle for reform. Their suffering was mentioned, but rarely for their sake. Exposure was weaponized, less about justice for women and more about power struggles among men. You notice how even exposure reinforced the bishop's centrality. When scandals erupted, they did not lead to dismantling episcopal control. Instead, they justified councils, decrees, and reforms, all of which reaffirmed bishops as guardians of purity. The church condemned their sins, but preserved their roles. Virgins were still entrusted to bishops, even when bishops had been caught exploiting them. The paradox is maddening. Exposure proved abuse, but abuse proved the need for more episcopal oversight. The women themselves vanish from these records. Their names are almost never written. Chroniclers describe them only as virgins, brides of Christ, or victims. Their silence is part of the exposure. Scandals reveal bishops' sins, but erase women's lives. You realize the cruel truth. Even when the system admitted corruption, it still denied individuality. Virgins were symbols, never persons, even in scandal. Still, the echoes linger. The satirical poems, the reformers' sermons, the vague but damning decrees, they all whisper that communities knew bishops' abuses were no secret. They were public enough to demand containment. Exposures were not rare exceptions, but inevitable eruptions in a system built on unchecked power. Each scandal is a crack, a glimpse of truth breaking through the church's polished facade. And so you step back, absorbing the irony. Bishops took virgins in the name of God, and when caught, were rebuked in the name of God. Exposure revealed corruption, but reinforced the same structures that enabled it. The scandals never shattered the system. They patched it. Virgins continued to vanish into cloisters. Bishops continued to preach purity, and the cycle endured. Yet the whispers, the chronicles, the satire, all remain, faint witnesses to the truth beneath the incense. The bells ring again, as if to drown the memory of scandal, but you hear them differently now. Their chime carries not only holiness but hypocrisy, not only ritual but exposure. Each note says, the truth was known, if not always spoken, revealed, if not always punished. And in those echoes lies another piece of the puzzle. Bishops took virgins in the name of God, and sometimes the world noticed, but the noticing rarely brought justice. The scandals could not stay buried forever. Too many whispers piled up, too many satirical verses stung, too many councils repeated the same warnings. Eventually the weight of corruption demanded an answer, and that answer came in waves of reform. Resistance did not always roar. It often whispered, petitioned, or wrote carefully. But across centuries, a slow and stubborn pushback rose against bishops who cloaked abuse in holiness. For once the system that protected them began to crack, if only slightly. It begins with the earliest church councils. Long before reform became a movement, bishops themselves sat in synods, condemning practices they privately committed. The Council of Toledo in the 7th century declared that bishops who defiled virgins would be deposed. The decree sounds righteous, but its very existence proves the sin was common. These early councils mark the first flickers of resistance, not from victims but from rival bishops who wanted to preserve the institution's image. By the 9th century, reform rhetoric sharpened. Carolingian rulers demanded tighter discipline among clergy, issuing capitularies against bishops who lived scandalously. Monastic reformers like Benedict of Anianen insisted that bishops stop interfering in convents for personal gain. Charlemagne himself lectured clergy on purity, aware that moral rot endangered both church and empire. This resistance was political, as much as spiritual emperors needed bishops to look holy if they were to legitimize imperial power. Corruption became not just a sin but a liability. The 11th century brought the most famous reform surge, the Gregorian Reform. Pope Gregory VII thundered against simony, clerical marriage, and sexual corruption. Reformers accused bishops of keeping concubines, defiling virgins, and turning holy offices into markets. Their language was fiery, their tone uncompromising. They wanted bishops to embody the purity they preached, or at least to fear consequences if they failed. For the first time, reformers named sexual exploitation not just as personal vice, but as institutional rot. Monastic voices joined in. Figures like Peter Damian wrote blistering tracts, exposing clerical sin. His Liber Gomorianus condemned sexual abuse, particularly of those under ecclesiastical care. Though his words focused heavily on homosexual acts, he did not spare bishops who preyed on women cloistered in convents. Damian insisted the church's credibility crumbled each time a bishop defiled a virgin. His rhetoric shocked some, infuriated others, but it forced conversations that bishops could no longer smother in incense. Women too found ways to resist. Abbesses occasionally wrote to Rome, complaining of episcopal interference. Some convents sought exemption from local bishops, placing themselves directly under papal authority. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, scolded clergy in her letters, warning them that exploiting virgins invited divine wrath. Her visions, written with apocalyptic urgency, challenged bishops to repent. Though she could not dismantle the system, her words offered rare female resistance in a world that expected silence. The Lateran Councils institutionalized reform. The First Lateran Council, then 23, forbade clergy from living with women, except near relatives. The Fourth Lateran Council, when 2015, mandated annual confession for all Christians, but also warned bishops against exploiting their pastoral role. These decrees acknowledged abuses openly enough that ordinary people could see the cracks. For once, reform was written not as rumour or satire, but as canon law, binding across Christendom. Resistance had become official, even if enforcement remained weak. Local resistance also grew. Townspeople sometimes barred bishops from convents, accusing them of abusing visitation rights. Chronicles record cases of mobs jeering bishops, hurling accusations, even pelting their processions with filth. Lay anger rarely toppled bishops, but it sent a message. Silence had limits. Communities may have bowed in ritual, but outrage simmered beneath. When conditions allowed, that outrage burst forth. Resistance was not only clerical, it was communal, born of long resentment. Satire sharpened into sharper critique. Writers like Chaucer later mocked corrupt clergy in biting verse, giving literary voice to centuries of frustration. Fabio lampooned bishops who preached chastity while chasing skirts. These texts did more than entertain. They eroded the aura of sanctity, making ridicule a weapon. Once laughter stripped bishops of mystique, obedience became harder to enforce. Resistance could live in jokes when it could not live in laws. Reform also came from rival clerical orders. The Cistercians, preaching austerity and purity, contrasted themselves against luxurious bishops. Mendicant friars like the Franciscans and Dominicans challenged episcopal wealth, emphasizing poverty and preaching among the people. Though they did not directly dismantle bishops' control over virgins, they siphoned away some of the authority, offering communities alternate models of holiness. Their very existence was resistance, a reminder that the bishop's way was not the only way. Still, resistance was dangerous. Bishops retaliated against critics with excommunication, fines, or political pressure. Reformers walked a narrow line, denouncing corruption without undermining the church itself. Many silenced themselves out of fear, but others pressed on, convinced that truth mattered more than safety. Their courage carved small spaces of accountability, however fragile. The fact that their words survive shows that even in a culture of silence, resistance endured. The late Middle Ages saw more dramatic exposures. Councils in the 13th and 14th centuries deposed bishops for scandals too blatant to hide. Records show charges of simony, concubinage, and exploitation of nuns. Though these cases were rare, they proved resistance could win. Communities celebrated when a corrupt bishop was removed, even if another soon replaced him. Each deposition chipped at the myth of episcopal invincibility. Mystics also resisted through theology. Women like Catherine of Siena preached purity, not as submission to bishops, but as direct union with Christ. Her letters scolded popes and clergy alike, urging reform. Though she herself embraced virginity, she redefined it as personal devotion, not institutional control. Her visions reframed holiness as something no bishop could broker. It was resistance through reimagination. If virgins belonged directly to Christ, bishops lost their monopoly. Secular rulers joined the fight when expedient. Kings and princes, eager to curb church power, sometimes encouraged exposes of clerical abuse. Accusations of bishops exploiting virgins became weapons in larger political struggles. Though self-serving, these moments gave victims a chance at vindication. When a king sided with reformers, bishops could not rely solely on church protection. Resistance grew teeth when thrones turned against mitres. By the 15th century, preachers like Jan Hus and later Martin Luther seized the theme of clerical corruption to rally reform movements. They denounced not only indulgences, but also sexual hypocrisy. Luther mocked bishops who forced celibacy on priests while living in sin themselves. The Protestant Reformation magnified centuries of scattered resistance into a tidal wave, shattering episcopal authority in half of Europe. Virgins were no longer pawns of bishops but symbols in the battle for religious freedom. Yet even within Catholicism, reform did not die. The Council of Trent in the 16th century reaffirmed clerical celibacy but tightened discipline, demanding stricter oversight of bishops. Seminaries were founded to ensure better moral training. Convent life was more heavily regulated, paradoxically increasing control but also reducing opportunities for abuse. Resistance, long fragmented, had finally reshaped the institution itself. You realize, though, that reform was always double-edged. Councils condemned abuse but rarely restored freedom to virgins. Instead, reforms often reinforced episcopal control under stricter rules. Women remained confined, even if their guardians were scolded. Resistance chipped at corruption, but not at the underlying system. Still, the very act of naming the sin, of punishing even a few, cracked the aura of untouchable sanctity. Bishops could fall, and that knowledge alone gave courage to critics. As you leave the echo of councils and sermons behind, you sense how hard-won resistance truly was. Every voice raised against bishops risked ruin. Every decree required immense courage. The fact that so many tried and sometimes succeeded proves that silence was not absolute. Beneath the weight of incense and ritual, resistance whispered, and in those whispers you hear the beginnings of change. The bells toll again, but this time you hear more than obedience. You hear the echoes of reformers' shouts, abbesses' petitions, communities' riots, poets' laughter. Resistance was never enough to topple the system entirely, but it was enough to reveal its cracks, and in those cracks shines the truth. Bishops took virgins in the name of God, but not everyone let them do it quietly. Some resisted, and their defiance still lingers in the record, stubborn as stone. You might think that once reformers thundered, once councils legislated, once scandals were whispered into chronicles, the story would have ended, but the truth is harder. The legacy of bishops' control over virgins did not die with the Middle Ages. It lingered, reshaped, echoed across centuries. Practices shifted, names changed, but the underlying pattern remained. Men cloaked in sacred authority claiming women's bodies, choices, and voices in the name of God. What began in cloisters carried forward into seminaries, missions, convent reforms, and even into scandals of our own day. Start with the early modern church. After the Council of Trent in the 16th century, bishops doubled down on their supervisory power. They insisted on stricter enclosure of nuns, walls higher, gates locked, correspondence monitored. Ostensibly this was reform, meant to prevent abuses. In practice, it reinforced the very dynamic that had always existed. Bishops controlling virgins as assets. They now did so more tightly, justifying it as protection. A paradox. To stop abuse, the church built higher cages. This enclosure, codified in the papal bull Periculoso, 1298, but enforced more rigorously after Trent, became the defining feature of convent life. Women who once had small freedoms, visiting family, receiving letters, walking in gardens, were now sealed off entirely. Bishops argued that such walls shielded virgins from worldly temptation, but families and critics saw what really happened. Women's voices disappeared, and bishops' oversight deepened. The legacy of control was now institutionalized, harder than stone. Missionary work exported the pattern across continents. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, missionaries established convents and schools for indigenous girls, urging virginity as the highest calling. Bishops overseas adopted the same rhetoric of mystical marriage, the same economic patterns of dowries and donations, the same surveillance of female bodies. Indigenous women were folded into an old system in new lands, their choices reduced by the same claim. This vow, this surrender, is for God. The legacy spread with empire, cloaked in evangelization. The rhetoric of mystical marriage persisted too. 17th and 18th century devotional manuals still spoke of virgins as brides of Christ, urging women to imagine themselves caressed by his love. Sermons thundered with familiar images, gardens enclosed, lamps lit, crowns of light. The words sounded unchanged from medieval pulpits, and though reformers had once condemned abuse, The language itself carried forward the dependency. A virgin was still imagined as Christ's bride only through the bishop's hand. The legacy lived in metaphors. Scandals did not disappear either. 17th century Europe saw accusations against bishops who maintained too close ties with nuns. 18th century convents wrote to Rome complaining of intrusive oversight. Even in the 19th century, visitors noted the oppressive control bishops exercised over female orders. The names were different, the rules more codified, but the complaints echoed the same refrain: virgins enclosed, supervised, and sometimes exploited under episcopal power. Reform had polished the surface. It had not uprooted the root. Literature kept the memory alive. Enlightenment critics mocked bishops for hypocrisy, writing plays and pamphlets that exposed clerical lust. Voltaire sneered at the idea of holy fathers guarding virgins, twisting it into satire. Anti-clerical movements in France seized on old scandals to justify revolution. The bishop who once appeared untouchable in his cathedral was now lampooned on stage, proof that the legacy of control had become not only history, but ammunition in politics. Virginity, once cloaked in mysticism, now appeared as farce. Yet, even revolution could not erase the structure. After Napoleon, as the church rebuilt, bishops regained their role as guardians of women religious. 19th century convents in France, Spain, and Italy still required episcopal visitation, still demanded dowries, still taught mystical marriage. Women joined willingly at times, but the underlying system, male supervision of female chastity, remained intact. The legacy stretched on, braided with tradition, resistant to change. The 20th century brought harsher exposures. Investigations into orphanages, schools, and convents revealed systemic abuses, harsh discipline, forced labor, and sometimes sexual exploitation perpetrated under clerical oversight. Bishops often knew and did nothing, echoing medieval patterns of silence and complicity. Victims' voices were buried beneath theology and power. Communities whispered, reformers shouted, but institutions resisted. You recognize the pattern instantly. The same cycle of promise, abuse, silence, and only partial reform. The centuries changed nothing essential. Modern scandals involving clergy and minors echo the medieval story almost exactly. Bishops, entrusted with care, instead enabled abuse, silencing victims to protect the institution. Reports detail how bishops transferred guilty priests rather than punished them. Just as their predecessors moved abusive bishops quietly to other dioceses, the victims were not always consecrated virgins, but the structure was identical: authority unchecked, bodies controlled, silence enforced, reform delayed. The legacy had not vanished. It had metastasized. The language of mystical marriage lingered even in modern religious orders. Young women entering convents in the 20th century were still told they were brides of Christ, still given rings and veils, still overseen by bishops who retained the final say in their vows. Though many embraced this sincerely, the structure repeated the old imbalance. Vows officiated, supervised, and recorded by men who claimed divine authority. The continuity is stark. Medieval rhetoric lives in modern rituals. In places like Latin America, Asia, and Africa, where Catholic missions flourished, bishops maintained similar dynamics. Families gave daughters to convents with dowries, convinced by promises of holiness. Bishops gained prestige, wealth, and loyalty, and in some cases, abuses followed, with reports of nuns exploited or silenced. The system proved portable, adaptable, almost indestructible. Where the church went, the legacy of bishops and virgins went too. Even art and culture carried the memory. Paintings of virgins receiving veils from bishops adorned churches well into the 19th century. Visual propaganda of obedience and sanctity. Novels of the Romantic era mocked or mourned cloistered women whose vows were decided by families. Anti-clerical satire became popular across Europe, poking at the same wound: bishops who claimed holiness but consumed innocence. The public had changed, the art had shifted, but the echo was clear. Some reforms of the 20th century, especially after Vatican II, tried to soften the structures, convents were given more autonomy, strict enclosure relaxed, and bishops encouraged to act less as overlords. But the shadow remained. Even with greater freedom, women religious still answered to bishops for major decisions. The language of protection persisted, a polite echo of the old cage. The legacy did not die. It evolved into subtler forms. Survivors of abuse began speaking more loudly by the late 20th century. Their testimonies sounded eerily medieval, priests demanding silence, bishops intimidating families, communities complicit. Once again, women and children bore the cost while men in power shielded themselves with holy words. The scandal was modern, but the structure was ancient. Reading these accounts, you feel as though the centuries collapsed. The bishop in his palace, the virgin in her cloister, the silence all around. Even outside Catholicism, the pattern influenced culture. Protestant polemicists during the Reformation seized stories of bishops exploiting virgins as evidence of Rome's corruption. These tales passed into popular imagination, shaping centuries of suspicion toward clerical authority. The bishop became, in the cultural memory, both shepherd and wolf. The legacy was not just lived, it was remembered, weaponized, retold as cautionary tale. Today, historians trace these continuities with sobering clarity. They show how theological ideals of virginity, rituals of consecration, economic incentives, and political alliances all created a system ripe for abuse. Bishops were not uniquely monstrous. They were participants in a structure that handed them unchecked power. That structure proved durable, bending but rarely breaking, surviving reform after reform. Its legacy is not only past, it is present, woven into the stories still unfolding. You stand in the cathedral once more, the bells tolling overhead, and you feel the centuries collapse around you. The incense may fade, the vestments may change, the councils may multiply, but the pattern persists. Bishops claiming virgins in the name of God, communities silencing themselves, scandals erupting, reform nibbling at edges, the cycle beginning again. The legacy stretches like a chain from medieval cloisters to modern courtrooms, linking past to present with links forged in silence. And so, you see why history matters. To ask why bishops took virgins in the name of God is not merely to study the Middle Ages, it is to confront a pattern that still casts its shadow. The legacy is not buried, it is alive, stubborn, uncomfortable, and until it is fully faced, it will echo, tolling like the cathedral bells across centuries, reminding us that silence protects the powerful far more than holiness does. You have traced the structures, the scandals, the reforms, the legacies, but none of it means much without asking the most human question. What was the impact on the women themselves? For behind the councils, the politics, the wealth, the sermons, there were lives flesh and blood shaped, narrowed, and often broken by bishops' control. To understand why the story matters, you must listen for those faint voices, muffled by stone walls and lost parchment, yet still echoing in the silence. For many girls, the first impact was the erasure of choice. A daughter might be 12, 14, or 16 when her family offered her as a virgin. She had little say. Obedience was expected. Some embraced the decision, perhaps sincerely drawn to the mysticism of the church, but many were coerced, pressured, or simply too young to understand. Their lives were decided in council halls and pulpits, not in their own hearts. The impact was a theft, the theft of agency, disguised as holiness. Once consecrated, a virgin's life was confined. Convent walls became her horizon. Contact with family diminished, movement was restricted, correspondence censored, even joys that might have softened the burden. Gardens, music, art were regulated by bishops who could tighten or loosen rules at will. The impact was a shrinking of the world, a narrowing of possibility. For women who once dreamed of marriage, children, or travel, the cloister was both tomb and stage, where their lives were buried yet displayed as examples of sanctity. Psychologically, the emphasis on purity weighed heavily. A virgin was taught that her body was her only treasure, that her worth depended entirely on preserving it. Any failure, whether real or imagined, brought crushing guilt. Confessors interrogated thoughts and dreams, branding even desire as sin. Women internalized shame, fearing they had betrayed Christ with every flicker of longing. The impact was a deep fracture in the self, natural humanity recast as corruption, requiring endless surveillance. For those exploited by bishops, the consequences were worse. Coercion masked as confession, intimacy demanded under the guise of guardianship, silence enforced with threats of damnation. All left scars that cannot be measured. Women carried trauma in bodies and memories, yet were denied even the vocabulary to name it. To accuse was to risk exile, disbelief, or eternal condemnation. Their impact was isolation, suffering endured alone, unspoken, while the world praised their purity. Families, too, were affected. A mother might mourn the daughter she rarely saw. A father might resent the land he surrendered. Yet both silenced themselves, convincing each other that the sacrifice was holy. The impact rippled outward, grief reframed as pride, loss reframed as salvation. Whole households were reshaped by the presence of an absent daughter, her body behind cloister walls, her absence haunting the hearth. And through it all, bishops thrived, insulated from the pain they orchestrated. Communities lost too. When women were enclosed, villages lost their labor, their marriages, their voices. Daughters who might have woven cloth, borne children, tended fields, or led households were instead removed. The demographic impact was subtle but real. Fewer alliances, fewer heirs, fewer women in civic life. In their place stood silence, a gap filled with ritual, but empty of lived presence. Communities praised the virgins, but they also bore the cost of their absence. Not all impacts were purely negative. Some women embraced convent life, finding education, companionship, and relative autonomy within cloister walls. A few rose as abbesses, wielding authority otherwise impossible in their era. For them, the bishop's oversight was a nuisance, but not total. They carved out spheres of power through learning and prayer. The impact for these women was paradoxical. Empowerment within confinement, creativity within control, yet even they remained tethered to bishops' authority, never fully free. Literary voices reveal another layer. Some nuns wrote mystical poetry, describing visions of Christ as bridegroom. Their words shimmer with longing, beauty, and genuine devotion. The impact here was spiritual. Women transforming imposed vows into authentic faith, making meaning from constraint. Yet their writings also reveal tension. The desire for intimacy, the struggle with obedience, the pain of silence. Beneath the luminous imagery lies the shadow of control. The bishop's system left marks even on their ecstasy. Generationally, the impact endured. Younger girls grew up hearing tales of consecrated sisters, saints, and martyrs. They learned to expect that virginity might be demanded. The culture shaped their imaginations, narrowing what futures they could envision. The bishop's control seeped into the very dreams of children. The impact was not only on individuals but on generations, shaping medieval womanhood into a script written by men in robes. Economically, women bore the brunt as well. Families traded dowries for salvation, but the women themselves rarely touched the wealth. Nuns lived modestly, often austerely, while bishops and cathedrals prospered. The imbalance was stark. Women's vows fueled male authority, while their own lives remained materially restricted. The impact was systemic exploitation, where the cost was borne by women but the benefit enjoyed by men. Socially, women consecrated as virgins were placed on pedestals, praised as holy, yet stripped of individuality. Their names vanished into titles: Bride of Christ, Consecrated Virgin, Enclosed Nun. Communities celebrated them as symbols, not people. The impact was erasure. Their humanity dissolved into archetype. They lived and died as examples, their real stories lost beneath layers of rhetoric and ritual. Even in memory they were silenced. And yet, in small ways, women resisted. Some slipped letters past cloister gates, preserving their voices. Others fled convents, risking disgrace for freedom. A few spoke boldly, like Hildegard or Catherine, challenging bishops with visions and sermons. Their impact was limited, but enduring. They remind us that not all women surrendered silently. Resistance flickered like candlelight in the dark, fragile but real. The long-term impact reaches even into modern times. Survivors of clerical abuse today speak with words eerily similar to medieval virgins' silenced cries. They describe betrayal by trusted guardians, intimidation by threats of damnation, communities complicit in silence. The continuity is chilling. Medieval women's suffering is not just history, it is echoed in the present. The bishop's shadow stretches across centuries, its impact still alive. Spiritually, the impact was profound. Women were told their suffering was holy, their silence sacrificial, their obedience salvific. Some internalized this so deeply that pain itself became a form of worship. Others broke beneath the weight, despairing that God himself was complicit. The impact here is tragic. Faith twisted, hope poisoned, devotion weaponized. Where women sought God, they too often found only bishops. Historically, the impact is invisibility. Records preserve bishops' names, councils' decrees, scandals' outlines. Women's stories survive only in fragments. A letter, a chronicle's aside, a poem half copied. The women themselves vanish, absorbed into collective anonymity. The bishop system achieved even this, erasing the voices of those it controlled. The impact is silence layered over silence, making recovery difficult, yet all the more urgent. You pause and reflect on the weight of it. The impact on women's lives was not abstract, but lived. Lost choices, silenced voices, confined bodies, reshaped families, altered communities, broken faith. Some carved meaning from it. Some resisted. Some suffered quietly until death. The bishop's claim over virgins in the name of God left no part of medieval womanhood untouched. Its consequences were intimate and vast, personal and systemic, immediate and long-lasting. And so you stand in the cathedral one last time, the bells tolling above, and you hear not only ritual, but memory. Each note carries the echo of women's lives, too many to count, too many to name. Their impact cannot be reduced to decrees or scandals. It is written in silence, in absence, in the spaces left behind when daughters vanished into cloisters. It is the human cost of a system that cloaked domination in sanctity. When you leave, you know the question has been answered. Bishops took virgins in the name of God because structures allowed it, culture enabled it, and silence sustained it. But the price was paid by women, paid in lives narrowed, voices silenced, and futures stolen. That impact endures, whispering still from stone walls, parchment scraps, and the faint echoes of bells. And now, as the night gathers, let the story drift more softly. You have walked through cathedrals and convents, through councils and scandals, through centuries of silence. You have seen power cloaked in gold, and you have glimpsed the hidden cost paid by women who lived and died within those walls. It is a heavy tale, yes, but here, at the close, you can let its weight fall away. Imagine the cathedral bells, no longer tolling in command, but fading gently into the dusk. Their echoes soften, no longer chains, but whispers, dissolving into the night air. The incense, once heavy, thins until it is only a trace, sweet and distant, like smoke vanishing toward the stars. The voices that were silent stir faintly now, not in sorrow but in peace, like wind in tall grass. Breathe slowly. The stone walls crumble in your mind's eye. The gates open, and the women long enclosed walk freely into the fields. Their veils are gone, their laughter rises. No bishop controls them, no vow binds them. They are themselves again, bright, human, whole. The story that bound them loosens, and they fade into freedom. And you, lying here now, need carry none of the weight. Let your breath steady, your body grow heavier, your thoughts softer. History has spoken its truth, and now it releases you. Close your eyes. Let the silence of centuries become the silence of rest. Sleep gently, knowing the story is finished, and you are safe. Sweet dreams.